any scientific theory of consciousness must be able to do the following things. So first is, it must explain why consciousness exists. Second is, what are the causal effects of consciousness? Like each moment of experience, what is it doing? Why is it useful for evolution? The third one is the palette problem. All of these Qualia values and varieties, like the blueness of blue and the smell of cardamom, and like where do they come from? What is the relationship between them? I would say that a full theory of consciousness must be able to output, hey, this is all of the possible qualia, and this is how all of the colors are related to each other in a network of just noticeable differences. You also need to be able to explain the binding problem. In other words, how information is put together into unified wholes. And finally, you must be able to explain every weird experience. So for example, if you take DMT and you experience hyperbolic geometry, how does the visual system generate that hyperbolic geometry? A theory of consciousness must be able to explain that as well, which is, why I think like all theories of consciousness right now are incomplete, because they're not predicting, for example, hyperbolic geometry on DMT. That's kind of like, well, that's a very strange thing that happens. Nobody's predicting why. Well, I have some ideas of why that happens, but it is one of the constraints, right? Like every weird experience has to be accounted for as well for a theory of consciousness to be complete.
Welcome back to the Demystify Psi podcast. Today we have a special treat for you. We are bringing together two of our previous guests, Andrés Gómez Emilsson and Ogi Ogas, to discuss their very different takes on their experiences in studying encounters with entities in all sorts of altered states of consciousness, from meditation to psychedelic drugs and everything in between. Particularly as it relates to this phenomena across the ages, right? It's not just a modern phenomena. People have been experiencing contact with angels, with religious beings for all of time, as far as we can tell. And so it seems like a really important thing to understand, if only about how our own brains and minds are organized, but perhaps something even deeper about our place in the cosmos.
And the conversation comes in two parts. The first part is a baseline discussion of consciousness, because Ogi comes at it from the hardcore neuroscientist, mathematical perspective of somebody who studied under Steve Grossberg, and Andrés comes at it more from the phenomenological, frequency-based explorations that they're doing at the Qualia Research Institute. And so we first have to lay the groundwork down for what is consciousness if we're going to start to deal with entities that appear to us in the experience of consciousness. And so once we get through that, we start to dig into the entities and what their different fields of study allow them to say about these beings that seem to appear to humans over and over and over again in different iterations and in different kinds. And obviously, they're both coming at it from really different perspectives, and so we get this very interesting survey of what it could mean. And I think that the truth is somewhere nebulously represented at the interface of all of these different ways of exploring. And so it was really, really satisfying to hear their perspectives. I doubt that this is the last time that we're going to be talking about it, because it just is kind of a bottomless collection of things to mine. And so thank you to both of them for taking the time. You'll notice that the conversation shifts location halfway through, because the first time that we recorded it, we lost the back half of the conversation. And so here we are presenting to you in its completed full form, and we really hope that you enjoy it.
Remember, our podcast is entirely listener supported. So if you enjoy these kind of programs and you want to see them continue and get better and stronger and help us get better guests, consider coming over to patreon.com. Join our team, really. Get together with us. We meet once a week and discuss what's going on in the world of science and philosophy and where we can go with the project. And if you can scrape off the tiniest piece of your paycheck, it will make sure that we can put more and more of our time towards making this a better, more powerful project. And a huge thank you to all of our patrons. We love you guys, and we couldn't do this without you.
Amen.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Demystify Psi podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
You have a fascinating intersection of interests, which is entities, but you come at it from radically different directions. And over the course of conversations with both of you, we kind of came to realize that there was probably an interesting conversation that could be had between the two of you.
Yeah. Thank you for having us. And I mean, I think obviously like consciousness more broadly, it's a topic of shared interest. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And like the specific manifestations of what is consciousness. And so one of the things that you guys wanted to talk about was, Daniel Dennett's passing and the legacy that Daniel Dennett left in the realm of consciousness. And after reading Consciousness Explained, I think that there's probably some time that we could spend on, dualism versus non-dualism and what an explanation actually would look like, because I was very frustrated reading Dennett. Like I respect that he's a titan of history and he's a titan of philosophy, but I just felt like he was making.
But he's not a titan of consciousness. I mean, so here's the fundamental thing about Daniel Dennett. He's a philosopher, and he came up in a time where it was the last vestiges of philosophy, and he took philosophy and he applied it to science. You can't do science as a philosopher. You can't figure out quantum physics. You can't figure out relativity. They weren't figured out by philosophers. Chemistry not figured out by philosophers. Biology not. Evolutionary theory not figured out by a philosopher. And what I mean by this is his mode of thinking, the style of thinking and intellectual analysis he brought to consciousness was devoid of math. The guy doesn't know any math. He doesn't have a math background. He's not approaching it mathematically. He's not approaching it neurally. He doesn't know neuroscience or neural system. He doesn't read the academic literature, and he's not conducting experiments. He's sitting on a sofa trying to figure out consciousness. You have just as much luck figuring out gravity that way, or quantum physics, or anything else. So
in defense of that, I do think that it is theoretically possible to reason your way to a viable theoretical understanding of a lot of scientific or a lot of natural phenomena without necessarily being a scientist. But I think that Dennett makes categorical.
It's never happened. What's one example of somebody figuring out some scientific discovery of consequence that just noodled their way there?
I mean, don't you think Darwin's sort of in that camp? Like
Absolutely
he wasn't trained
Have
as
you
a
read
scientist.
Origin of Species? That depth
I mean, as much as I
of
could.
evidence, the depth
Right.
of
He
evidence.
definitely cataloged the natural
compilation of it. He's the exact opposite of a philosopher. I mean, the guy is the definition of a scientist. The rigor.
The rigor. I think that that's something that I came across with Dennett, where I felt like it wasn't particularly rigorous in terms of taking into account, the state of the field. Andrés, you're laughing.
Well, no, let me say a couple things. I do think a lot of scientific progress does happen through philosophy, although it may not look like it at first. So, for example, Einstein, I would say a lot of his contributions come from like thought experiments, like thinking like, okay, what would happen if we're traveling at the speed of light and we see in a mirror? Of course, these thought experiments are grounded in empirical evidence, right? Like at the time, people were like very puzzled by the fact that, hey, why is light looks like that is moving at the same speed, no matter how you're measuring it. Okay, like taking that as a constraint, then thought experiments become really powerful because you realize, hold on a second, there's a bunch of logical incongruities that come about from like reasoning how we normally.
But then from that comes the math. I mean, he gave us E equals MC squared, an obvious example. He mathematized it. So there's always philosophy in any creative process, whether it's science or art or literature, what have you. But philosophy needs to turn into science at some point to actually achieve anything or discover anything or to know anything. To me, philosophy ultimately is a way of thinking that's about the human experience on a human scale. I came to this realization. I was reading Bertrand Russell's essay. He's got an essay called Mysticism and Logic. And it was filled with science that was wrong. He said, scientifically, this, and this. It was more than 100 years ago. but even at that time, like he was saying things that maybe they're not right now. We know they're not right, and so he was basing a lot of his philosophy off of bad science. But like his focus in the essay was always coming back. When I realized reading this one, this is when it finally hit me. Always coming back to the human experience. What is it like to be a human in the world? And for me, that's philosophy. That the great philosophers talk about what it means to be a person in this crazy universe, how we should behave, what should we do. I think that's the realm of philosophy. But figuring out how gravity works is not the realm of philosophy, nor is figuring out how consciousness works. Dennett came up when so little was known scientifically about consciousness that he managed to slip through the door. He was there at a time when most scientists knew nothing about consciousness. Though, let me say one very crucial thing. Stephen Grossberg had already figured out the key physical dynamics of consciousness and talked about it with Dennett. So Dennett had heard it. Dennett attended one of Grossberg's lectures and heard it before he ever wrote Consciousness Explained. And he went in a completely non-scientific direction, pure philosophy, instead of taking advantage of the evidence and the science and the math that was already available when he wrote Consciousness Explained.
So I think that the philosophical difficulties of working with scientific ideas are apparent with something like the philosophical zombie thought experiment, right? Where it's this idea of like, okay, so if you have someone who acts and behaves as if they are conscious, but they have no internal experience that motivates any of their actions, could you possibly know? And I'm like, that's not even a thought experiment. Like, at least with Einstein, I'm like, you can have the thing of like, okay, imagine somebody's on Earth, imagine somebody's in an elevator falling through space or whatever. But the idea of a life form that's able to act without an internal experience, I think muddies the waters so deeply and so pervasively, because you have people that really believe that the thought experiment of the philosophical zombie is something that is plausible or
profound,
or not even profound, but just possible. Like, sure, like we can mock the adherence to the profundity of it, but I think that what amazes me more is that the experiment is thought to be plausible. Andrés, what do you think?
Oh, I think it's a very important thought experiment. Okay, so let me say a couple things. So maybe I'll put pins on these, because one is kind of like the contribution of philosophy in, for example, like electromagnetism, and then also how I think that will parallel contributions to consciousness. Another thing I want to put a pin on, maybe we can revisit later if you guys are interested, is reading Daniel Dennett, not so much as a philosopher, but actually much as somebody who was doing like social moves. Like it's actually kind of I have a sociological perspective on like what is going on with Daniel Dennett as opposed to a philosophical one. But yeah, to tackle the important one you just mentioned, I do think philosophical zombies are an important thought experiment. Right now, right, like we do have like large language models, and a lot of people apply kind of like this dismissive kind of attitude of like, well, if it quacks like a dog, behaves like a dog, it's obviously a dog. If it behaves like it's understanding, it, acts like it's understanding, it obviously is understanding, obviously has some kind of inner experience. But, there's like a bunch of reasons why that may not be the case. So like the absolute, most simple, we have like, in principle, you could have a lookup table that just essentially has recorded every possible, like input, output necessary to convince you that, they have an inner experience. But a lookup table just doesn't have the internal complexity necessary to even encode a subjective experience. So there's got to be some gradient between, okay, a fully formed human and a lookup table where, okay, the information structure, the implementation is adequate for consciousness. And actually, like putting it very clearly, like, hey, a lookup table would not be conscious. So it's not just a matter of behavior, right? Like we have to look into the details of what is happening inside to determine if something is conscious or not. I do think that's a very valuable insight.
What's the sociological angle on that? Oh, okay.
Okay.
Let's hear that first. Go ahead, Ogi.
Well, I was going to say, the zombie experiment is exactly the kind of misguided, distracting philosophical experiment. It's easy to understand. It's easy for people to talk about. We're talking about it here. What's hard to talk about is top-down, bottom-up resonance, the dynamic equations that control whether the a complicated dynamic wave ends up in oscillation, and how that ends up oscillating with other modules in the brain. That talking about that stuff, which is really how you talk about consciousness, is hard and confusing and mathematical. But just getting it down to this simple idea: is a zombie conscious? Can we imagine a zombie being conscious? Could a person not look and talk and act like a person and yet have nothing inside? It seems like it's taking you into a world of make-believe and fantasy and abstraction that's not at all grounded in anything physical to do with consciousness.
Well, so I think from my reading of it, I'm like, these guys are getting ready for AI or AGI maybe like a decade before, and they're not talking about it in the sense of building a technology yet. Like when Dennett does the P-zombie thought experiment, he's not talking about, okay, imagine that we could build a computer program that does this thing. And so he's not saying it out loud, or maybe he does somewhere, but it wasn't like in my cursory reading of it. But I think that that's really what he's getting at. And so they're forecasting forward to the thing that we're at right now that Andrés is pointing to, which is, is a machine that tells you it has an experience conscious, or is it just reading the entire corpus of human literature about what internal machine consciousness looks like and just spitting back at you the stories that we have told ourselves? And I'm like, at some point, you lose the ability to tell the difference. And that's what's really weird, is because like if the fantasy of the consciousness is good enough, I feel like you can't disentangle it from reality. And that's what Dennett is playing with. And so on one, I think that it's important
Is that the sociological angle?
I think it might be, yeah.
Do you want me to comment on the sociological maybe? And then, so I would classify as Dennett, for context, for like computational theory of consciousness, also illusionist, eliminativist at the end of the day. He was really, really emphasizing, okay, like consciousness is a bag of tricks. It's not a thing. There's nothing you can systematize about it, truly, because there's no specific boundary around this phenomena. It's actually a loose collection of very different phenomena put together, and we reify it. But yeah, he's a computationalist. Let me explain what that means. So David Marr, cognitive scientist from MIT, came up with this way of analyzing information processing systems, which divides it into 3 layers. So the first is the computational level, which is the input-output. This is kind of like the behavior of a system. How does the input-output of the system work? The second level is the algorithmic level, which has to do with like, okay, what data structures are we using? What is the flow of information inside the system that is allowing this information to get processed? And the third layer is the implementation level. At the physical grounding, how are the physics equations allowing this algorithm to be instantiated? Different philosophers and different thinkers, scientists, put consciousness at different levels of this hierarchy. At the Qualia Research Institute, we're very explicit that we think consciousness is at the implementation level. The classical argument for why it's not at the implementation level is because essentially us talking about our experience must be at the algorithmic level because it deals with information flows. One important caveat is that actually these levels in some contexts are connected, such as, if you're using algorithms that employ fields or employ quantum coherence or something like that, you cannot really distinguish very well the implementation and the algorithmic level, because there's some algorithms that require specific implementations, right? Like if you want to run a quantum computing algorithm, you require quantum coherence if you want to have the runtime complexity speedups that comes with this technology. Okay, so Dennett was, I would say, hardcore computationalist, maybe algorithmic theory of consciousness, but he didn't care about the implementation, right? Like whether this is like neurons or silicon, ultimately doesn't matter. But most important of all, he was deflationary. Like he was saying, like, well, there really isn't a specific phenomena that has to do with consciousness. At the Science of Consciousness, which I just came back from this big conference, they had this big reflection on like, okay, the field of consciousness. David Chalmers mentioned Daniel Dennett, and he described him as the way actually Daniel Dennett described himself in the conference was he said like, "Oh, I now know what it is like to be a cop at Woodstock," meaning, like busting all these hippies with their crazy ideas and like wild ideas about consciousness. But essentially, okay, like if you're in a position like Dennett, where you're just saying, okay, you're not going to convince me there's any science to this because it's actually not a phenomenon, it's a very comfortable place to be in, right? Because you can dismiss anybody, right? Like you don't have to look at the details. It's just kind of a catch-all attitude, and it has status and power. And I think like it is because it is kind of this. Well, let's put it this way: the base rate of bullshit answers to consciousness is very, very high, right? So like you might as well round it out to all of the answers are bullshit, and that is kind of the social move that is happening there. Is something like such deep skepticism that anybody is likely to make any progress that you might as well actually just dismiss everybody, and that's the vibe I get from that crowd.
From the Dennett crowd?
Yes, which is very prevalent, and a lot of very smart people are into that vibe, and it's very hard to get them out of it. Actually, extremely difficult.
In general, if a person's like in a digital world, if they're doing AI or programming or thinking about algorithms, then then they end up there because consciousness is not digital. You can't have an algorithm for consciousness. It's nonsense. It's just silly. It doesn't make any sense. Consciousness is physical. It's analog, like anything else. It's no different than digestion. So we don't need to talk about the algorithm of digestion.
It's physically produced, right? It's projected from the physical. Is that what you mean? I mean, it's an idea, right? It's not a physical substance. I think that was one thing that really disturbed me. Yeah, that was one of the things that disturbed me when I first started reading the Dennett book, was that he tosses out this dualism thing on account of the fact that the mind can't be a substance. And I thought that was very bizarre, because it's obviously a concept, right? It's obviously an idea.
The key to understanding consciousness and getting past all these silly thought experiment and barriers is consciousness is activity. The mind is activity. When you start thinking about physical reality as activity instead of things, then it all makes a lot more sense. And the irony... I
guess my point is that you can't have activity without actors, right? So something has to be doing something.
The activity is acting. The activity is the actor. I mean, this is the... If you want the mind-bending thing that's going to get you consciousness, it's all activity. Who are the actors? Activity. Activity acting with other activity. It's all activity.
Oh, well,
that's a terminally irrational statement. Like it does...
No, the ocean currents are all activity.
But they're the action of water molecules, right? They're water molecules.
Yeah, like we were thinking about this the other day. Like, what causes
the water
wind?
Molecules are in motion. It's the motion of the water molecules.
Right, the water molecules are important.
Perfect example. Let's talk about it.
Really
perfect example. You're like, what? Well, the water molecule isn't that making the currents? It's not making the currents. It's part of the current.
The action of the water molecules produces
the current.
Yeah,
it is the current. It's the movement of the water molecule.
But the water,
it's not the molecule, it's the movement of the water molecule.
Right, but there's still an actor at the bottom of that.
Like in the absence of the molecule, you couldn't have the current.
So you go all the way down. What's the molecule?
And this is you've stumbled upon our problem with
activity. At the bottom's activity. There's no place where you end up with substance.
I think that's irrational. I think that so like I hate to open up that can of worms.
I mean, in the same sense that an irrational number is indeterminate.
I can tell you exactly why you think it's irrational, why your consciousness is doing it. Because our consciousness is quite literally designed, its whole purpose and function is to take the activity of the physical universe and convert it into things. When we have resonance, every conscious experience is embodied in a physical resonance in the brain, top-down, bottom-up resonance. If you put a person in the brain scan, when they're conscious, you'll see a resonance somewhere. That's the physical activity of consciousness. When we have that resonance, it converts into a thing. The resonance becomes a thing. The whole reason it's resonance, why consciousness is predicated on that, resonance is stable. It extends over time and it holds in place. We think of the world as things because we think in terms of resonances. Resonance is actually an activity. It's an activity in our brain, but our system interprets it as a thing. We look at the world as things. I've talked about this, I think on a previous show. This is what scientists are always doing this. They thought fire was a thing. They thought heat was a thing, caloric. They thought fire was a thing, phlogiston. Biologists thought life was a thing, elan vital. And all of them, had the same arguments about why the thing's real, it's irrational. How can life be a bunch of activities? There's got to be some magical substance in there. How can heat be an activity? Heat's got to be a physical thing. We're going to find it. We're going to find this caloric and take it out.
The problem is not that it's an activity, it's that it's the activity of some physical substance in motion. Like heat is molecules moving in a particular way, deforming the material in a particular way with a particular resonance to it. And I just think that we get into the weeds if we don't recognize that consciousness is the activity of some physical actors doing something.
Right. I'm not denying that. But so for heat, you can have anything moving. That's the point. It doesn't matter if it's iron moving or water moving or aluminum moving. The thing itself does not matter. You can put anything in there. If it moves in this way, you get heat. You can put anything in a mind. If it moves in the way of consciousness, it will become conscious.
All right.
If you put things in life and it moves this way, if you have something with reproduction and metabolism, it doesn't matter what it's made of, but if those are the activities, you've got life. So the thing itself,
as long as we recognize
it's not that the thing itself is not irrelevant, but it's really not as important as one thinks it is. People are so consumed with finding the magic gene, the magic neuron, the magic neurotransmitter, the magic cell that contains whatever the thing is, life, autism, schizophrenia, consciousness. It's always an activity at the bottom.
Can I comment on this? So,
Yeah, please.
a couple of things. So, I mean, I do value a lot this insight that a lot of things are improper reifications, where we think like, oh, there's a thing to be found here. Definitely the case with life, like thinking like, well, there's elan vital, we're going to find the substance of life or something like that. And okay, it turns out it's molecular complexity built on top of molecular complexity. I very
activity
much
is what it turns out to be, but yes.
Activity. But let me provide two broad kind of like comments here. One is, and I'll explain both. So one is the distinction between activity and things is actually a little bit more subtle, I think, and I'll explain why. The second one is I actually I used to be in the camp, many years ago of consciousness is like a process, is like an activity, but I actually think it's a thing now. And you might think like I completely reverted, but no, I do think it is based on a couple key insights, and I'm happy to go into them.
What do you mean by thing? Before I do want to hear that.
What is the difference between like a thing versus a process? Ultimately, I think like the reason why we will need something like a thing actually to account for consciousness has to do with the instantaneous integration of information, or like the fact that there's like many pieces of information at once on any.
Why does it have to be instantaneous? There's nothing instantaneous.
We'll get to it. We'll get to that. But then the reason why I think like there's actually the distinction is less clear than we may think has to do with like your choice of representation. Okay, so the classic example is you may look at like the planets going around the sun, and you see like, okay, like you require some kind of like dynamic process inherently to explain what it is, right? Because if you just describe the positions of the planets relative to the sun and relative to each other, that doesn't tell you how they're moving, right? However, there is this other representation, which is called a phase space or a state space, where actually what you represent is not only the position of the planets, but also their velocity, right? And then you can treat that as an object, as a mathematical object, and then apply equations that describe its evolution in this state space, which is a configuration space. And there's in a sense, you can think of that as a thing. And so you can describe processes in terms of state spaces, and under the right conditions, you can actually say, well, okay, this becomes the mathematical object of study. And in that sense, like it does have kind of a thing quality, right? It's putting a lot of pieces of information at once, is behaving as a unit.
But you don't see that as reification, though?
I don't think so, because especially when you have like holism, especially when the thing is behaving as a unit, like for example with eigenmodes in quantum mechanics or field behavior, I don't think it's really that much of an improper reification, because hey, like if the whole thing is actually acting as one, and you require that kind of like unity to explain the physical behavior, it's not like beyond physics or anything. Physics describes this, but this holism, I do think like it captures some kind of.
I mean, we can go with that, but I would suggest that the primary difference between material objects and anything else is that material objects can be statically conceived. They don't require dynamics to be conceived. So the chair that I'm sitting on right now doesn't require any dynamic conception in order for me to imagine it and work with it in a physical presentation. But I understand what you're saying. And when you get into mathematics, mathematical objects can be multidimensional and dynamic and all of this and so forth. And so if by consciousness being a thing in terms of a mathematically, let's say a dynamic object in this sense, an abstraction, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, the primary reason, and maybe this is in the second component, the primary reason why, okay, maybe we don't call consciousness a thing. There is a paper by Susan Pocket that is called "Consciousness is a Thing, Not a Process," which I recommend looking into. But okay, let me give you
a dynamic pattern,
which is also where philosophy like can help science. So this is like with how electromagnetism was discovered, right? So people were really trying to make sense of electromagnetic phenomena using this ontology of like particles and forces, and imagining, hey, like the universe is made of particles and forces that repel and attract each other. But there's some experiments that just don't make sense, like involving like capacitors or like gaps in your circuits. Like, hey, there's no particles moving around. Like, why is this whole circuit working? And the key insight of Maxwell and Faraday was actually like realizing that these are fields, that they introduced an ontology. It's a different ontology. This is a philosophical move. Is coming up with a new ontology to explain phenomena, which is like fields and differential equations that explain the ripples in the fields. It's not a universe of particles and forces, right? It's a fundamentally different thing. And with that aesthetic, all of a sudden, a huge number of phenomena were able to be described precisely in terms of equations. But yeah, I would describe that move as a philosophical move. I think we will require the same thing for consciousness, that actually we need to model consciousness as a field so that we can solve long-standing questions like what are the boundaries of experiences, what are the causal effects, and what are the equations that describe consciousness. It is very related to resonance. So I think like there's huge overlap with Ogi and Grossberg, but I think there's other things. There's also topology and a couple other things that resonance doesn't capture. But anyway, just opened a huge can of worms.
Let me give you the solution to the hard problem, why the hard problem was always misguided. It's relevant to exactly what we're talking about. The hard problem being this imagined jump from first person to third person, from third person to first person, from objective to subjective, from the public objective activity of the neurons in our brain to the private subjective experience of the world. So this is usually the hard problem. How there seems to be a gap, a jump. We pass from one to the other. How does that happen? That seems mysterious. That seems to be the hard problem. The solution, pretty straightforward. There's no objectivity. There's no third person. There's no thing. The idea of there being a thing out there, that's the illusion, the things in our head, the things what our consciousness produces for us. We imagine thingness.
How do we have a head?
The head is the activity of protons and photons and electrons interacting in a particular way. It's activity. Right. Well, so you're a physicist. Let's take it all the way down. Okay.
Yeah.
Things. So activity of molecules. What's a molecule? Is it a fixed, frozen thing that's just there, and you know exactly? You point to it, touch it. We can move it from here to here. It's electrons and protons interacting. They're in constant activity, motion. Take electron. What's an electron? Where is it? Can I put it here in my fingertip and just keep it there, and tomorrow it's going to be there in the same place? I know.
Well, I would say there's been a lot of mistakes in the history of interpreting the fundamental experiments with electricity and so forth that have reified.
Get right to the thingness then. So show me the thing in physics.
So they've reified this action of the surface of the atom into an actor called an electron. So they made it a magical fluid, like they did with heat. The magical fluid of electricity is the electron. And so if you go back to these fundamental experiments, there is a reasonable way of interpreting the action of electricity as the surface motion of atoms. You might have to reconceive of the shape of the atom a little bit, but it can be done.
Well, the word you just said is motion, which is, again, activity.
Motion of the actual surface material of the atoms involved, right? So there's still a material actor in motion at the end of the day.
What I would say is, and this cuts through so much bullshit and confusion, our brain is telling you, electron, it's your brain, your consciousness, the resonance in your cerebrum is insisting to you to think of it as a thing. It's not a thing. Even the way it came to you, activity, hitting the activity, generating activity. There, at no point, was there ever a thingness. It was activity out there. We don't even see electrons. The way the electrons reach us is through all these intermediums. You're talking about something as if you know it and you can see it and you can touch it and you look at it, but that's not the case. We think about them. The only way we can think about the universe is as things. Our consciousness carves it up into objects for us so that we can actually act in the world. This is how we can purposefully act in the world. We have to treat the world as things. Invertebrates do not see the universe as a world of things. They see the universe as a world of patterns, different thing. In order to interact with a world of things, you need consciousness. Consciousness is what we evolved. It's the third level and the third rung on the ladder of purpose. At the bottom of the molecular minds, they see the universe in terms of points, little points in space. Then are the neural minds, the invertebrates, jellyfish, insects. They see the universe as a collection of patterns. Then are the module minds, the animals, the vertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. They can see the universe in terms of things. Humans, we go a step further. Because of the supermind, we can see the universe in terms of ideas. So for us, we've even got something that's not even things. We're so sure about things, and we're so sure, like so much of this conversation we're having, especially with Andrés is saying, is treating ideas like things, which is, we have to. That's what our brain's designed to do. In order to talk about something, it has to be stable. It has to have a thingness to it. Words, letters, concepts, ideas, all of this. A song, a melody. A song is pure activity. It does not exist anywhere. Where is the song? Can I put a song in a box and carry it around? It's purely activity, performance. And yet, if I say jingle bells, like we all have a sense of that. It feels like a thing out there that we can reproduce, we can buy, we can purchase it, we can move around, but it's activity. When we buy it, we're buying some activity that's going to have some activity in our ears.
So to go back to this idea of, invertebrates don't see things, they see patterns.
Right.
But if the invertebrate mind was able to start to think about what this all meant, it would be a terrible mistake to say that all there is patterns, because the patterns are representative of things.
The environment?
Of the environment, of events that are in the environment, of things that come into your field of vision. And so the invertebrate that looks at the pattern and is like, okay, well, that's actually representative of a thing, would be an invertebrate that would be on the path to evolve into a more complex mind downstream. Hold on one second.
Did this thing come from the old world?
Yeah, so this is, Andrés, before you came on, I was telling Ogi, when we immigrated from the Soviet Union, my parents brought like 300 pounds of books, and they also brought this clock.
Sorry.
I'm not hearing anything. Is there?
Oh, you're not? Okay, that's
no, it's muted. Yeah.
There's
what you were. Oh, okay. Sorry for everybody listening.
I thought you were looking at invisible beings.
No, there's this grandfather clock behind us that was just chiming the top of the hour. Sorry, guys. That probably made no sense to you.
Okay, so
register in the mics.
The invertebrate that looks at the world and sees patterns and stops at patterns is going to have an incomplete picture of nature. And the invertebrate that's like, okay, the pattern is representative of something else that ought to be understood, is an invertebrate that will evolve in the direction of, I think, progressively more complex consciousness that leads them to, a million years from now being able to actually see things. And so now the question is, okay, so now that we see things, we also understand that the things have motion and relationships, and the next level of our conception is these massive systems that play together, and we have the rules that tell us how the systems work. And it seems like a perfectly reasonable and logical set of understandings, but
That's
getting
the field approach that Andrés
that is the
talking
field
about.
approach. But I'm like, I don't think that you get rid of things, because the things are there. It's just that the things are also in motion, and they have patterns
The
that are
things are not
governed.
interesting. That's the best way to put it.
That might
The
be true.
things are just not interesting. They can be, because they can be anything. You know, a storm, whether it's a hurricane of water and air in the ocean, or a hurricane on the surface of Jupiter made of all kinds of exotic gases, it's still a hurricane. And so the things are just not that interesting.
As long as we don't forget they're there.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I'll say a couple of things, which is there's several things maybe we're conflating a little bit. When it's the process of reification, so there's a whole thing there having to do with like how do we construct reified things in our consciousness. I think this involves like interplay of attention and awareness, because you can deconstruct it. Like you can access meditation states where you stop reifying things, and maybe they're like more the experience.
Can we define that word for people who might not have heard it before? Really
Yeah.
quick? Sorry. I'm sorry. I should have done that.
So here's just an example, right? It's like if I'm holding this pen on a normal, typical state of consciousness, very mundane. You would look at it and you would interpret it as like, well, here's a thing. There's a boundary around it. There's a functionality. In fact, right, like we suffer from functional fixedness, which is we see this and we see a pen, right? Like we don't see like just a stick, right? We actually see the intentional stance actually embedded in the object. It's part of how we construct representations. But let's say you access like a higher jhana or like a deep meditation state, and you open your eyes. Actually, what you may experience is like a blob of color, and you may not even like put together very well like a boundary around it, and it may be kind of like jagged, or like you're just not putting kind of like pressure on attention to try to like put all the features together. You're just so relaxed that the features just hang in there, and they don't get bound together into compact representations. I mean, meaning that like the feeling of things being a thing, I think is a phenomenology. It's like a feature of our experience, completely malleable. Now, what Ogi was talking about, which is that there really aren't things out there. I'm actually very sympathetic to that view. That like no, the fact that we interpret these as a unified object, as opposed to like these two things together as a unified object, that is a matter of convention. Like I do think like if we were to zoom in really carefully on this pen, actually we would not see a clear boundary between like the pen and the air around it. It's all of these are like fuzzy boundaries. It's all completely a matter of convention. However, and here's where it gets really interesting. I do think there is a meaningful conception of coherent bound objects in physics, which is topological pockets. I mean, this is a very new and radical, different way of thinking about this, but it's grounded in physics. I mean, I'll just give you one example, which is in the sun. You sometimes see, at the eclipse, for example, these like solar flares and coronal mass ejections, these huge plasma tubes. Turns out this is a topological effect. So essentially the plasma moving at these enormous speeds changes the electromagnetic field, and then the electromagnetic field confines the plasma. So it actually forces it to move in these tubes that they're trapped in. But then when these tubes touch each other, the actual field lines exchange partners. This is called magnetic reconnection. That is a topological change. And when you have that topological change, millions of tons of plasma get sprayed into, outer space. It's a macroscopic topological change in the field that gives rise to massive causal effects. And I think that is like a well-defined, bounded object that is objective. It's not a matter of convention, like where the boundary of these topological pockets end and begin. And our hypothesis at QRI is that actually a moment of experience is actually a topological pocket in the field. So it's a very well-defined object, but it's not a thing in the conventional sense of like, well, your consciousness doesn't end at your skull. It ends at the topological boundary in the field, which may be inside your brain. It's a little bit more of a stranger object than we're used to.
Well, certainly, I don't know
André,
necessarily.
I see where you like philosophy, André.
No, but this makes precise, empirically testable predictions. Like we're looking into ways of quantifying the topology of the field, and yeah, I mean it is something that generates predictions, and I think it's falsifiable. It's within the domain of science. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that I would be surprised if you discovered that it was entirely inside of the brain, because the example that you make of the pen during jhanas, you open your eyes and it's this fuzzy blob of color that you have a hard time differentiating from the rest of the outside universe. Okay. If you zoom into it and there's a fuzzy boundary and you start to realize that the surface is this thing that's constantly exchanging, it's shedding whatever microplastics it's shedding, it's also...
That the whole of your experience is contained in your brain. It is just causally attached, to your body, and there's like a lot of like feedback and information transfer. But in our model, it's something like there's something like an archipelago of topological pockets all throughout your body and everywhere in your system, and they're all competing to merge with the central pocket. And the way they're competing is by trying to minimize prediction errors and fit with pre-existing priors. In some sense, they're trying to minimize this balance between how much does this information fit with previous experience and how much does it accurately represent sensor input. And when you find this overlap, usually that is what you become conscious of. And I think, it's a very fast evolutionary process that is selecting for these features that try to accurately represent the world fitted with previous experience. But the actual experience, if I were to, give you my best guess, is mostly located in the thalamus, maybe with some tendrils extending to the cortex in a very dynamic fashion. There's a lot of things that make me converge to this view. Just one very simple empirical fact is you can damage the cortex really severely and still be conscious. I mean, there's these cases of people with like 80% of their cortex missing, and they have.
Well, that's because we've got multiple, like more than a dozen consciousness generating modules. So it's not one thing. I mean, this is it's entirely decentralized. Yeah, you're talking about a central pocket. There is no central pocket. It's designed. The whole thing system. The whole reason the brain uses things is because of its distributed, decentralized, design.
True, but here's another empirical fact. If you damage the thalamus, even just a little bit, you either go into coma or die. So like the thalamus is extremely sensitive when it comes to like modulating consciousness. And my guess is that, the cortex is playing more of a kind of like...
No, I mean, if you damage the brainstem, you'll be unconscious and die too. And the brainstem's not fundamental to the conscious experience.
Right. But that is a good point. I would say there's other converging factors, like, the sort of like profound alterations that happen when you do TMS on close to the thalamus. The more central you get, essentially, the more dramatic the effects tend to be. Whereas
some of the resonant loops of consciousness do go through the thalamus. There's corticothalamus resonant loops.
Very, very central, right? Like the cortical thalamic loop.
What are the things that you see?
There's no key piece of the brain for consciousness. It's the nature of the design. This whole thing system. The whole reason is turning things into things is so that it can have a decentralized design. What am I talking about when I say it? It's thingness for a decentralized design. This is fundamental to understanding consciousness. Mm-hmm. We have different modules in our mind. Each of these modules, some of the modules produce consciousness and some don't. This too is why I think a lot of what Andrés you're talking about is more philosophical, because what you should be able to do, if you've got some approach, you should be able to predict what forms of thinking in the brain are going to produce consciousness and what forms of thinking will not, and why. And very clear answer. All the forms, everything that needs to form consciousness needs to form a thing, because other parts of the mind need to make use of it. You need to have a stable thing so other parts of the mind can reach over and grab it. Well, actually, they oscillate with it. They resonate together. But you can think of it as, here's a basketball I'm seeing. Now my audio module will reach over and synchronize with that to hear the basketball too. So we've got all these modules, each doing something different. There's a visual what module, object recognition, audio what module, object recognition based on sound. We have the why module. It generates feelings. Why should I do this? Because I'm angry, because I'm hungry, because I'm sad. The why module. Each of these modules is independently capable of producing consciousness. Not one of them is key. Like there's not the conscious module. If you lose it, no consciousness. Just like Andrés said, you can carve up the brain all kinds of ways, still be conscious, because as long as you have one consciousness generating module, you'll be able to hit consciousness. So the reason, this is the whole design, the whole beauty, the elegance, the brilliance of consciousness. It allows each module to independently do its own thing. If a module says, hey, I think I've got something important here, I hear the sound of trumpets behind me, but I'm here alone. How can there be trumpets behind me? So the trumpet sound resonates. It stabilizes. We've become aware of that thing. The sound of the trumpet is a thing. Trumpet sound. It's actually an activity, but again, our brain trips on that thing. That thingness resonates in our brain. Now the other modules can make use of it. My visual module, I can turn my head and look at the thing, and now my visual modules, oh, there's a man with a trumpet who walked in my back door and he's standing there playing the trumpet. Now the visual and the audio will resonate together. And then the feeling module, the Y module, will come in and resonate that. That's a weird and scary event, is that we're all resonating together. But you need to have stability, and the stability comes through thingness.
Okay, so this
The
is really
things that
interesting.
the things we don't need. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no, so this is really interesting because my admittedly superficial read of both of your guys' theories has been that you're in deep alignment about the nature of consciousness, which is that it is these stable resonances that form things, and that it is the interaction of those things that is the experience. But it seems now, listening to you guys, that's not the case.
It's very so. What I'll say is like I do think pretty much everything Ogi is saying here is true, which is like there's different modules. They're all capable of consciousness. Importantly, in the QRI model, essentially this is a wave computer. Each of the modules specializes in producing different types of waves. I've played many hours, like dozens and dozens of hours with like systems of coupled oscillators that have programmed just to kind of like get a sense of like, okay, if you were to build a wave computer, what you can do, you can wire a system of coupled oscillators so it produces standing wave patterns, traveling waves, spiral waves, chaotic attractors, all of those, just by fine-tuning the connections. And my sense is that, each module specializes on different types of waves. And for sure, the way in which our phenomenal world is constructed is by the syncing up and the cross-frequency coherence between these different wave behaviors. However, I would say that this is still not enough for like a bound experience. Resonance is not enough. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I think the missing key piece is actually topological segmentation, so that you can actually have objective boundaries. Maybe I'll say one thing. This is definitely in the realm of philosophy, but again, I do think philosophy is essential here. This frame comes from David Pearce, which is any scientific theory of consciousness must be able to do the following things. So first is, it must explain why consciousness exists. It must explain the causal effects of consciousness.
So that we can interact with the world as things, is why it exists.
Okay.
And more generally, it manages global attention in the brain, and it manages global learning in the brain, and it manages. Go ahead.
Okay, so the 5 criteria, just real quick, is why does it exist? Second is, what are the causal effects of consciousness? Like each moment of experience, what is it doing? Why is it useful for evolution? The third one is the palette problem. All of these Qualia values and varieties, like the blueness of blue and the smell of cardamom, and like where do they come from? What is the relationship between them? I would say that a full theory of consciousness must be able to output, hey, this is all of the possible qualia, and this is how all of the colors are related to each other in a network of just noticeable differences.
Hold on. Yeah,
Sorry.
You also need to be able to explain the binding problem. In other words, how information is put together into unified wholes. And finally, you must be able to explain every weird experience. So for example, if you take DMT and you experience hyperbolic geometry, how does the visual system generate that hyperbolic geometry? A theory of consciousness must be able to explain that as well, which is why I think like all theories of consciousness right now are incomplete, because they're not predicting, for example, hyperbolic geometry on DMT. That's kind of like, well, that's a very strange thing that happens. Nobody's predicting why. Well, I have some ideas of why that happens, but it is one of the constraints, right? Like every weird experience has to be accounted for as well for a theory of consciousness to be complete.
I actually, those questions sound fine to me. They sound entirely reasonable questions for consciousness. I think I get answers for them all using Grossberg's math and what Psychonaut did. But let me talk about Qualia, because Qualia really is the fundamental element of consciousness. If there was like a fundamental piece that would help us understand everything that's going on with our conscious experience, is Qualia. What is Qualia? Well, there's a precise physical explanation. It's a feature. What's a feature? A feature is a piece of resonance. So when we're having the resonant experience, what's resonating is a collection of features. It's the features that we're aware of. The only thing in the universe that we're aware of are features. If there's a feature in a resonant wave, then we are conscious of that feature. Some modules in our brain have resonance, produce resonance, but do not have features. We're not conscious of those modules. Even though there's a resonance, we're not conscious of what's happening in our mind. We don't have a conscious experience because there's no features. When we're aware of a feature, we can focus on it. When we hear a song, we can focus the melody, the rhythm, the lyrics, the timbre. When we look at something, we can look at the color, the texture, the shape. Each of these is a feature embodied in a very specific but identifiable physical activity in the brain. And the features, the resonant wave binds together. This is the binding problem. The resonant wave binds together a collection of features and says, these features go together, and here's the label. You know, that's a man, that's an apple, that's a song, whatever the case may be. But features, it's the currency. It's the currency of consciousness. And when different parts.
Isn't this just what Andrés is referring to when he says topology?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. Because it sounds like what you're saying is that there's like a shape to the resonance, which is like because Andrés,
it's not topological. Like there's nothing geometric or topological about it.
But if you have waves that are inside of a 3D space, don't you get a topology to it?
Not necessarily.
No. Okay.
I mean, one of the things, this is for illustration, right? Like Alan Watts will say something like, "We're waves in the ocean of being," or something like that. Poetic and like approximate, but the problem is that waves don't have clear boundaries, right? Like it's a matter of convention to say the wave ends here, but actually, you can interpret waves end, you know, at the point of infinity, or they end at, you know, you can put like a standard deviation maybe, but it's all a matter of convention. There's no precise physical feature that says here's the wave when the wave ends. So there's no boundaries between the waves, and for that reason, there's no clear way of creating an isomorphism between like wave behavior and moments of experience, which have a finite amount of information and are bounded. You need some mechanism to generate boundaries, and then for those boundaries to be useful, to actually be recruited by natural selection. I mean, of course, you may not agree with this premise, but it's something that I work with. Like the necessity for some mechanism to generate hard boundaries is just part of like what a theory of consciousness requires.
So I'm neither agreeing nor disagreeing with you. I want to share an actual mechanism in the brain, and I'd love, Andre, truly would love, based on what you just said, how you would interpret this or put this into your schema.
Yeah.
So when we see an object, to recognize an object actually requires two modules in our brain. It really requires more, but two main modules. One is the visual what module that generates consciousness. So here's my hand. I see my hand. I'm conscious. I recognize that's my hand. That's my visual what module. But for the visual what module to get this input, there's a pre-conscious visual scene module. The scene module assembles the visual scene. So like one specific thing this module does is it merges together surfaces and boundaries. There's two separate systems within this module, a boundary system and a surface system. So one says, here's the outline. The reason this is complicated is like if it's over my hand, is my head and hand one entity? Is if I get over my finger, is my eye part of my finger? You know, where's there's all these lines crossing. How do I know this is two objects and not, you know, a whole bunch of different little objects in there? The visual scene module, which does not generate consciousness, puts that together by taking boundaries and surface, and it does its own little, it's not quite a resonance, but its own little dance between these two. And then it puts together, it says, okay, here is a visual scene. Here's the boundaries, you know, here's the boundaries of this thing. Now I'll send it over to the visual what module. Good luck. In essence, the visual scene module identifies the features. It says, here's the features of what I'm looking at right now. There's 5 things sticking out. It's black and white, and you know, there's some creases here, and there's indentations. I'm going to, and it's a rough texture. I'm going to send that over to the visual what module. Take these features, and good luck. I hope you can identify what this thing is. Now, what I think is interesting about this is it's a module that's unconscious, that's assembling the boundaries of the things, and then it sends it over to something that's going to generate the consciousness. That's why I was curious what you would say about that, Andrés.
No, I mean, the information flow and mechanism you're describing seems very plausible, and nothing against that. I would, if anything, just kind of like try to fill in a little bit of like how that process happens, which I think it involves field computing. I think one visual illusion that Grossberg talks a lot about, but especially Stephen Lehar, one of Grossberg's students as well. I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
Not very, no.
Okay. Is the can is a illusion, which is like you have the 3 Pac-Mans and you get like an illusory boundary. Maybe you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, like there's 3 Pac-Man at the vertexes of what appears to be a triangle, but there's no triangle there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So exactly. I think there's like
3 Pac-Man all facing each other. So for the audience, like 1, 2, 3. Yep.
Exactly, and then there's like an illusory contour that emerges.
Right.
I
that's
think
generated in the visual scene module. The unconscious visual scene module is what generates that.
It's essentially
and it says that's a feature. I'm going to send that feature to the visual what module, which treats it as a thing. That's a case, Shiloh and Nastya, of a thing where there really is no thing underneath. So the fact that our brain can produce things and we're sure they're things, we see it. We literally see a gray dot and there's no gray dot there. So there's a thingness where there is no thing.
Yeah, exactly. This would be like a hallucinated thing, an improper reification.
Oh, it's just an illusion. Yeah,
an illusion. Yeah, but it does highlight a little bit of the algorithm of like how this is happening. Something Stephen Lehar kind of like tried to work out, where essentially, the visual system identifies boundaries, and then from those boundaries it sends waves, and these are like nonlinear waves. So essentially, you could imagine from each of the mouths of the Pac-Man, there's kind of these wave fronts. They converge in the center, and then they bounce off each other. So these are like nonlinear waves. So like linear waves go through each other. Nonlinear waves, they can bounce off each other. They can resonate with each other. They can form secondary structures. Based on a lot of converging evidence, I would say that the Pac-Man illusion works by waves getting converging at the very center, and then bouncing off and entering into this nonlinear resonance, which generates this triangle. And essentially, every reified object, like everything that you perceive as an object, I interpret it as a system of nonlinear resonance, where the waves are essentially bouncing inside and out, and forming the boundary, essentially bouncing off the boundary and creating like an internal representation inside. So that's reification and abstraction, which is, I think, part of the algorithm here. But I would still distinguish that, those are what I would describe like local binding effects. It's like how you put features together into unified representations. But then the actual unity of consciousness is actually more interesting than that, because it's not just like how you're putting features into objects, it's also how you're experiencing the background of your experience that is contextualizing the things that you're looking at. In other words, for you to make sense of a thing, you require to experience it within a context, within a background. And the entirety of your experience is both what you're attending to and the background and awareness that is providing the context for it. And I consider all of that as part of the instantaneous moment of experience. And like that is the boundary that I think you do require topology to explain. No, not the internal boundaries. Those I do think like just resonance, nonlinear resonance can account for.
So it's interesting when you say that the entire experience is important, because the Pac-Man visual illusion does depend on the contrasting background with the Pac-Man, right? So what you're really seeing is you're seeing 3 objects there almost. You're seeing the background, you're seeing the Pac-Man, and then you're seeing, if you imagine it being in 3-dimensional space, you're seeing a triangle that's the same color as the background that's been set on top of the Pac-Man.
Yes.
And so in that way, what you're seeing really is these separate pieces that interact with each other. And so it appears as if you're seeing a triangle that isn't really there, but if you were to map it onto 3-dimensional space to recreate it, you would actually have to have a third object, which is the triangle that sits on top of the background experience.
Yeah, and each of these objects, so there's a correspondence between the way something vibrates and its shape. This is something I'm sure Ogi is very familiar with. Where like the sound of a guitar is not actually the sound of the strings. That's a common confusion. Actually, the strings are making the whole guitar vibrate, right? And then like the sound of the guitar is the resonant modes of the whole object. So resonance has this very amazing property that you have a duality between the shape of something and the way it vibrates and the sounds it's making. I think that's essential, absolutely, to understand consciousness. Every time you reify an object, like see a triangle, see a square, it also comes with a vibration. And the way in which the objects can like be put together in your experience has to do with like, hey, are there vibrations compatible with each other? Can they interlock? We have a very strong bias towards interlocking things that are in harmonic relationships to each other, as opposed to random vibrations that they don't fit together. I mean, I think that's core aspect of the the algorithm of of our experience. It's much more stark on something like DMT, because if you look at like the Canny's illusion, the illusory contour on DMT, not only you see the triangle may appear and may start to multiply, and you may get like the whole vision may be filled up with triangles and stuff, but it's just kind of like taking that reification process like to the max. It's like, oh, you get a triangle, and then you get secondary triangles, and you get fractal triangles, and it keeps reifying and reifying and reifying. All of that, I think, is nonlinear resonance. That's like the underlying mechanism for that.
And so tie this back to topology.
Yeah. So then the question is also, okay, it's like, what is providing the boundary of your experience as a whole? Not like the objects inside your experience, but it's like, take a snapshot of your experience. It's a little bit tricky to explain what I mean by this, because there's actually a lot of elements of your experience that you're not attending to. And usually the only things you can remember about your experience were the things you were attending to, because by paying attention to things, you bind the features. Like when you pay attention to a color and a shape at the same time, they feel like a unified object. So that's what we remember. But all of the objects we perceive are perceived within a background of awareness that is providing the context. So when I say a moment of experience, I mean the whole thing. And now that whole thing also is vibrating in a particular way. And I think like the way the whole thing vibrates actually determines your mood. Like, are you having a good time or a bad time? It has to do with, are the resonant modes of the whole thing consonant or dissonant? I would claim that, if you're experiencing depression or anxiety, you actually have like a dissonant configuration where the resonant modes are actually not syncing up to each other. Whereas, if you have like a very deep meditative sense of peace, bliss, or love, that's going to be your shape whose resonant modes are very harmonious. I think that's kind of like what's underlying the valence, how good or bad an experience feels.
Andrés, I would actually say that's pretty close. You're missing a few. I think there's a couple things wrong in that, but that's pretty close. So what I would say is you're talking about the holistic experience, the background and the foreground. I would say anything in your conscious experience can be traced to resonance in a particular module. It might be your Y module giving you a feeling. It might be your where module giving you a sense of space. So whatever you say, but there's just this sense of awareness. Well, that sense of whatever the awareness is can be tied to some part of your brain that's generating consciousness. But what is true about, you're talking about waves coming together, that actually is what happens when you have a conscious experience, a multimodal conscious experience, like we're having right now. Talking is sound and sight at the same time. Multiple modules are resonating, and they resonate together to create this is the consciousness cartel. Multiple modules all resonating together as a single thing, and that will always have an entirely unique characteristic defined by the particular features. This global resonant wave will always have different features depending on what you're experiencing. But that's it. I mean, so in that sense, Andrés, you are right. Like whenever we have a conscious experience, it's a unified wave of lots of parts of our brain, lots of parts of consciousness generating parts with lots of features from many different parts. And some of those features will be like feelings and intuitions and a sense of space, but those are all grounded in the Y module or the when module or some other module.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're the kind of like underlying data structure you're assigning to a moment of experience is a network of resonance. Am I right? Where like you have
Yeah, I mean, I
all
would never
these
use the word data. Data is the wrong way to think about
data
any of
structure,
this.
a data structure.
Data and algorithms. It's not a data structure. No, and it's not an algorithm. Those are digital terms. Those are thinking the wrong way. Those are things, zeros and ones.
Well, I think that
when you have
this is what we started with at the beginning of the conversation, is that on some level, I think that there is a school of thought whose language is necessary to boot consciousness up in an artificial system. And so if you talk about algorithms, inherently you put yourself into that school, because what you're searching for is you're searching for a programmatic way of talking about the things that happen in the brain, because if you can take the features and the experiences and put them in context of data and algorithms and put them into an embodied digital object, then all of a sudden, perhaps you actually have gotten close to creating consciousness de novo inside an artificial system.
I mean, one thing I'll clarify. It's there is definitely a school of thought where you interpret algorithms as grounded in, let's say, Turing machines, and you have like the whole crowd, the Dennettian crowd, Churchill crowd, who the Church Turing thesis, for example, that says like any algorithmic any information processing has a corresponding Turing machine that can do it. I don't believe that. I think like that's a very narrow view of computation. But rather than teaching computation and algorithms, the move that I make it's enriching the concept of computation and algorithms to include being able to an analog processes. So I think of, for example, hey, like an algorithm that uses quantum mechanics, quantum coherence, an algorithm to find like prime numbers, factorization using quantum coherence. I do think of that as an algorithm, but it's an algorithm that uses physical building blocks that just behave very different than ones and zeros. And so when I say, okay, there is a data structure to a moment of experience, I'm not saying like, we're reducing it to ones and zeros, but there is a way the information is flowing. Yeah.
There's a simple and clear way to mathematically characterize the difference between algorithmic approaches to consciousness or anything, and actual biological consciousness. Algorithms and anything digital is the mathematics of integers. Consciousness is the mathematics of reals. So the whole reason, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, Turing's theorem, all of these are the mathematics of integer, discrete mathematics. But all of the mathematics of consciousness in the mind, you're dealing with reals.
But it does say
numbers that just go on and on and on and on and on because they're activity. Activity are reals.
But also
things are integers.
Quantum algorithms are like that too, right? Like you're using a continuous wave function for computation. I wouldn't deny the term algorithm just because you're using the reals. I think it's just like an extension of thinking in an algorithmic way. But I do think like
in
it
a
is meaningful to talk
way,
about.
right?
Mm-hmm.
In a programmatic way. Like I think that this is definitely important in the sense of like when I think that there's something about mathematics which is really important for science because it allows you to then predict and engineer, right? And this is kind of where the line between philosophy and science and engineering lies, because you can conceptualize something, you can tell a story, but then when you can mathematize it and you can put numbers on it and relationships between those numbers or waves or whatever else, it gives you the ability to then build a system. Like we never figured out what electricity was or the reason that electricity can cause magnetism and vice versa, but we did figure out the relationships between those analog features in such a way that you can then build a transistor, you can build a machine, and so we have all this technology that works on the basis of these algorithms that are on a physical level likely continuous. And we haven't figured out the thingness of them, but we've been able to build stuff with them. And so when the topics of consciousness become mathematized and turned into algorithms, even if they're algorithms that deal with these continuous subunits, I think that the goal ultimately is to build. It's not just an idle question of like, well, what is consciousness at that point? Because Dennett's approach of pure philosophy is just fine. Like, the math is the tool that lets you make a technology. And so if that's the ultimate goal, then why not talk about it in the sense of algorithms?
Yeah.
It's just the wrong math. You're using the wrong math. That's
well,
why.
but so you said that algorithms
Like
are
the math of relativity is tensor mathematics. It's not discrete mathematics, for example.
Yeah.
Quantum physics is a different mathematics too. I mean,
But I do think at least in the
every field has the correct, an incorrect math. I mean, this is quite literally the math war is right now about the mind. There's three broad competing mathematical approaches. It's that statistics, which is what AI is all grounded on, the information theory approach, which is the algorithmic digital approach, and the dynamic approach. And it's different math. I agree completely. You get the math right, but they're different math. I mean, if you're using the wrong math, you're going to get the wrong answer.
I would add maybe the fourth one would be the field approach, which
maybe that's I'm learning this from you, Andrés. So maybe we have to admit, I don't think it's a field approach dominant. I agree. It's a viable, meaningful, coherent approach. But
it's definitely picking up steam, especially like electromagnetic theories of consciousness. At least, for example,
I think it's obviously, I think it's nonsense. But it's legitimate math. That's different mathematics. The field mathematics is a different mathematics than dynamics and algorithms.
Yeah. Like I'll give you just quick example of something I would consider an algorithm that uses fields, which is like you can take a picture, and then if you take a concave mirror, you can actually find the right distance to that picture, such that like the reflection in the concave mirror focuses at a point, and at that point you can actually get a Fourier transform of the spatial frequencies in the picture. It's a completely an analog way of getting a Fourier transform, but that is like the sort of steps that I'm thinking. Like essentially, I think the brain is computing with pictures, is using whole gestalts for computation, and is making those gestalts interact with one another. And it's not ones and zeros, but it does have like a process, and there is like a system that is putting those pictures together and blending them, completely analogous and using the reals. But I would label that an algorithm, except it's just not an algorithm of ones and zeros.
All right.
It's just a matter of
in the interest of time, I was hoping we could maybe pivot over to entities.
Sure.
Maybe could we take like a 5-minute break to use the bathroom really quick though? Before
that sounds good.
Sounds good.
Okay.
I get a swig of water too.
Okay,
Right,
excellent.
we'll
See you soon.
Back at 5.
Yep. Andrés is like, there's 50 people in a room somewhere that might understand global politics. And Ogi's like, no, absolutely not. There's nobody who understands. And I'm like, the fantasy that we will find someone who can understand, I think underpins every single religion that has ever existed.
Yes.
Every single alien contact narrative that I've ever heard. And also I think AI. Because I think AI is the wet dream of the centralized planners, because you will have a godlike entity that will be able to...
Laplace's demon, right.
What's that?
Do you know Laplace's demon?
No,
It's
I don't.
the idea that there could be a computer that if you feed in all the information about the universe, it can make a prediction about the universe at any future point. So basically, Laplace imagined an all-knowing computer that could predict everything that will ever happen. So that's the fantasy.
And I think that's just such a human fantasy, because you live in the world and you're like, God, this is chaotic, and this is really the margins on this are slim. There's a lot of suffering. Perhaps we can do something that can fix that. And so we turn to these entities in one form or another as these actors that guide us. And so it seems like we're predisposed to even allowing it entry, because it's such a common and alluring fantasy that someone can tell you the answers. Someone has the answers. Someone can tell you how this is going to turn out.
Absolutely. But this is something that Intex calls the Failsafe Supreme. So this question, is it possible to know everything about our reality? Can there be a God?
Who's Intex, by the way?
So Intex are the entities, the intelligent extraterrestrials, which I've been communicating with for more than 30 years. They've been sharing math with me. I'm sure we'll get into more of the details of that. But one of the biggest lessons they've shared with me about the fundamental construction, the fundamental design of our physical reality is the Failsafe Supreme, that no one mind can know everything. This is a design principle. This allows for the existence of free will. We each, as individual humans, as individual sentient beings with fourth level minds, we are in possession of free will. We can make decisions for ourselves. We can have our own sense of purpose. And this is only possible because at no point can a single mind know everything. I will talk about the minds at the top, the axiomized minds. So there are minds with immense power and knowledge and insight and control over physical reality, and yet they too do not know everything. They are not in control of everything. They compete with other beings like themselves. This is part of the design of the universe, so that beings can constantly come, minds, purposeful beings like ourselves, like humans, like other races, can come into being, live our lives, pursue our own pursuits according to our own will, and not be subject to some supreme mind that we might feel is a malevolent mind. It's subjective whether that supreme mind is doing something we like or not like, whether it's good or evil is a subjective. But this way, none of us have ultimate submission. None of us are ultimate slaves, to some higher mind, some higher guide. And all the beings in the universe, especially the higher beings, they appreciate this. And so most of us work together to ensure that this dictum stays as part of the design of reality, that through the Failsafe Supreme, we can all participate in the cosmos.
And yet there is the impulse in some to orient the minds of others towards their bidding or towards their goals, right? Like that's also a central feature of human societies, which is that, yes, we all have this innate internal ability to decide and to have this will, and yet we do see that minds can be organized towards a certain set of goals. And I think that Andrés has seen a lot of this inside of the DMT entity space.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting conversation, and I look forward to digging deeper into it. Maybe a couple high-level things before we dive into it. For those who are like tuning in and kind of like wondering, okay, what I will try to add to the conversation. So, I mean, definitely, I'm gonna be in a very speculative mindset and kind of like very open-minded and explorative. I should mention that I do value very much kind of like really hardcore epistemology. So people, I want to put it out there that like, okay, like if I'm speculating on something doesn't mean that I believe it, but I just find it an interesting idea to talk about. And I'm just like, in general, I don't really have much qualms about kind of approaching controversial subjects or like things where new ideas may come up. I think, and I share that with Ogi, like in my case at least, it might be kind of maybe some mild autism of some sort, which has to do with exactly what you guys were saying, which is being able to dislodge yourself from kind of like a group mind, which if you're just completely lodged in a group mind, then like speculation about other possibilities is considered like betrayal or something like that. So, but I don't have that, and I think Ogi doesn't either. So I think we're free to speculate, thankfully. And another thing I will mention is everything that I will mention is kind of like a combination of roughly three things, right? Like, so one is like phenomenology, personal phenomenology, things that I have experienced, and also things that friends and people I trust have experienced, and doing deep dives in those conversations. The second is kind of like workshopping around these ideas. We at Qualia Research, we have like a phenomenology club. So like every couple of weeks, we gather, a team of people, we trust each other, have a long time relationship with each other, and try to like workshop, like what happened in different states of consciousness and how to make sense of it in many different ways, through the lens of mathematics or sociology or the arts, very, very open-ended. And finally, kind of science, like various objective measurements of the brain and psychophysics, psychology experiments. So that's kind of the evidential base. But again, it's going to sound very weird, some of the things I'm going to be saying. So Yeah, please don't take it out of context.
But a lot
Yeah.
of your work, a lot of your ideas and revelations have come both through personal experience, but also through countless interactions with other people who have been at the edge of exploration with different states of mind, alternative states of mind, I guess you would say, deep meditation in addition to psychedelics, maybe other states of mind that we haven't talked about. So you have a very observational uh, history with respect to these phenomena.
Yeah. And also iterations. It's like, okay, we've had a certain experience, then a year later we talk about it again, but like, having had more experiences and have had to kind of like time to process it. So it's really kind of like a multi-year think tank as opposed to just me speculating on my own. One key kind of like conceptual thing that I will share is that in terms of epistemology of psychedelic experiences or like meditation or alien contact, I make a very clear distinction between the semantic content of the experience, which is what the experience is about, kind of like how the mind encoded the meaning of the experience, versus the phenomenal character, which is like the low level, sensory properties or mathematical structures of experience. So to give you a very concrete example, on a DMT experience, let's say you might be looking at an alien that is telling you a message about planet Earth. Maybe that is like the semantic content, that's how your mind is interpreting what is happening. But then the phenomenal character would be something like looking at the texture of the clothing of the alien and noticing that there's wallpaper symmetry groups, and he's like, oh, that's a tessellation, and it's the star 442 tessellation, and like you're noticing mathematical details of the state of consciousness. And in general, I have found that we get more mileage in conversation and kind of like making sense of consciousness, talking more about the phenomenal character than the semantic content, because the semantic content under constraints the experience, right? Like when somebody gives you a given alien contact experience, you don't know if that was in salvia, phenomenology or DMT phenomenology or meditation, because there's many ways to get to the semantic content, or less the same way of describing it. But if you describe like, no, the low level features, they're going to be very different, right? Like salvia is very different than DMT and very different than meditation, right? So, but in the end, you need both. I mean, because, the semantic content is also encoded in the structure of the experience, is also telling you something about what happened, of course.
And the semantic content seems to reflect something about the culture and time period, as far as I can tell as well. Right? If you go back 1,000 years, people were having entity encounters that were encoded as deities from their religious scriptures and so forth, right? But they seem very similar to perhaps UFO abduction or UFO encounter, alien encounter experiences, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like how you can reason about your experience, or how can the experience reason about itself, is bottlenecked by what kind of archetypes you have to work with. And it does seem actually like some mind configurations are way more kind of what I would describe as like Qualia complete, able to kind of like bootstrap into like a more general like kind of intelligence. And others are like very constraining, where like if you are a hardcore believer of a certain religion in a certain cultural context, all the representations that you're going to experience in a psychedelic experience will be reinforcing each other. Like you may not be able to escape that symbolic system. And I don't know, I find that very sad. I prefer, of course, like open symbolic systems where like, well, there's always a way to bootstrap like more complexity, more algorithms, like new reflections on the system. Yeah, and I find, yeah, like kind of like really focusing on the phenomenology does that. Like it's like, well, however trapped you are, you can always try to notice details of actually how it feels like. That takes you out of like, the narrative, which can be really oppressive in some context, actually.
And this
Andrés,
actually,
I think it's wonderful what you're doing, Andrés. I just wanted to say that your approach to it, and I think is lovely.
yeah, it's a really, really
Thank
unique
you.
one that I think maps these details in a really new and clarifying way, because I think that these two aspects are they reveal. Let me see if I can put this into words easily. They reveal deeper patterns of human cognition that I think are relevant to mapping out the evolution of thought and the evolution of culture and the unifying features of it as well. Because, we try to understand what is consciousness, but if we can't understand the things that are the frame that is placed upon the stories that we tell versus the experiential details of it, we can easily conflate the two pieces and never actually be able to see the whole picture. And let's dive into this, the attractor space of the entities, because the Failsafe Supreme that lives inside of us does not seem to be something that cannot...
Let me just say real quick, the Failsafe Supreme, it's about the physical reality. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle derived from it, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, Turing's unstoppable theorem, all those fall out of the Failsafe Supreme. So it's something about the nature of the dynamics of purpose interacting with the dynamics of aimlessness, the way mind and matter interact. This falls out of it. The fact that you can't have a Laplace's demon. You can't have an all-knowing mind that knows every possible thing. I think it's possible to demonstrate this mathematically, but the math on this sort of thing is always tricky, and you're never really sure if you've got hold of the tiger's tail, so to speak, when you're doing the math. But I think indeed the math itself, ultimately, for something like the Failsafe Supreme, you need the whole universe itself. You can't really abstract away from it.
It kind of reminds me of how you can't have motion without at least two bodies, right? Like you need to have a relative displacement to something. And it seems like there's another law of reality or fact about reality that minds also have to be pluralized in the same way, because you can't understand something if there's nothing.
You can think of it like to be conscious of something. Consciousness requires a certain physical structure, certain highly complex physical structure that's going to be outside of whatever it is that you're conscious of. So there has to be the thing out there, and you have to have awareness of it. But that transition from there to here, you've already lost what's out there. And the transition is never perfect. You can't ever get a perfect from there to here because of the underlying nature of the physical activity itself. So in order to be aware of the universe, you need to have a conscious system, a mind system, a mental system, and that mental system will be separate from the physics you're conscious of. And in that transference, you're always losing information. There's always a change that you cannot possibly be aware of, is the basic concept of what's going on.
And yet there are always the attempts to systematize it, right? Like there are currents...
And standardize it and centralize it and unify it.
And to order it and to put it into convenient patterns that are predictable. And I feel like there is
And to agree upon one way of looking at it, right? This is the central crisis in science that we're constantly butting up against, is that science... People on the street at least hope that science is this monolithic thing that can give you an answer that is the truth. But the fact of the matter is that you just have a proliferation of theories that have to duke it out. And the truth is always somewhere in between them.
It's even more problematic than that. I haven't had a chance to talk about the ladder of purpose yet. I'll go into it in detail, hopefully, before we talk. But it's the idea that all the minds in the universe, including all the minds on Earth, have different stages of thinking based on the underlying physical details of the architecture of the mind. At the bottom is molecule minds whose individual thinking elements are molecules. These are bacteria and protozoa. Then there's the invertebrates. They have neuron minds. Then there's the vertebrates, mammals and birds and fishes. They have module minds. Humans, we're part of superminds. What is science? Science is supermind thinking. It's thinking across the supermind. It's our social mind, our community of humans mind, the human species mind, trying to figure out how our physical environment works, trying to understand our physical reality. This is what every mind does. Even down, the invertebrates, worm minds are trying to figure out their reality, but they're trying to figure out the reality at their scale, a world of patterns. And then come the module minds, like chimpanzees. They view the world as a world of objects. We humans view it as a world of ideas, but science is just thinking at this supermind level, at the fourth level of thinking. It's our perspective on the world. It's human perspective on the world. And we're trying to reach consensus, just like Shiloh says. We want to, because we want to, as a supermind, to have a single coherent account of the universe around ourselves, just like each of us individually want to have a coherent account of our social world, our physical world. But there's a level above science. When we finally achieve hypermind status, when all the superminds on Earth manage to combine and we form a hypermind, that will be an entirely new perspective, different than science, because we'll have a fundamentally different perspective. We'll have a collection of sciences. Different superminds will have different notions of science, rooted in their different physical instantiation in the universe. And then those come together to form a new perspective, and it doesn't stop. But science is just a fourth level perspective on the universe. And art, literature, painting is a third level perspective. Art is just, I as an artist, I as a single mind, here is my experience of the universe. Here is the Mona Lisa. This is how I see things. This is Lost Highway by David Lynch. This is my own personal take on the reality I see. Here it's very coherent in my art. It may not be your art. It may not be how your mind perceives the universe. And science is like that. Science is all of we humans together as a collective body. How do we see and understand the universe? How do we make sense of the universe? But another species and another planet will have had a different background, different history, focused on different things. They might be more acoustic than visual. They might have a more acoustic wave-based science, for example. And then those will come together to form a new perspective.
Well, it seems inevitable then that if you have these different practices which are generative, science is generative. It's the taking of ideas, of fitting them together, creating a narrative, and being able to gain some understanding of the world. Art does the same thing. It takes this phenomenological experience, transmutes it into a material representation, and then induces someone to feel something. Okay. But those things can then be harnessed, and art can be turned into propaganda, and science can be turned into technology. And those things seem to be the next level action of a higher entity. The same way that you can take a bacterium and you can transform it into something that produces insulin, you can take human consciousness and organize it into something that produces some technology or produces some outcome. And so it feels like the narratives around entities have to do with there being a battle of what ideology will maintain control, supremacy, or will guide the development of the lower minds. And
That's right. That's certainly what 5 shared with me, is that exact notion, is that all minds in the cosmos, humans, but any mind, we're all purposeful entities with our own unique individualized purpose. No two minds are identical. This is also a consequence of the Failsafe Supreme, is that each of us are utterly unique across all the cosmos. There will never be an identical Shiloh or identical Nastya somewhere. There's not infinite mirror worlds where there's infinite Shilohs identical to you. You have to be unique. Otherwise, if you were not unique, if there was another identical Shiloh in another world, I could use my knowledge of Shiloh here and go, take over that world as the conqueror. I could be Kang the Conqueror and use all my knowledge of you that I acquire here to go there. So you can't have perfectly identical individuals. That would undermine the Failsafe Supreme and not allowed. But that means each of us have our own purpose and our own chance to create something entirely new in the universe that keeps the universe going. This is also a piece of the Failsafe Supreme, is that each of us are creating something out of our own self. I might write a novel, I might paint a picture completely different from what Shiloh would paint or draw. And that new work of art that never existed before. Physics didn't predetermine my novel. Physics didn't predetermine my painting. It's a purposeful entity. It's something new in the universe, and who knows how it's going to change the flow of the world. And that's what's so wonderful. The universe is being created anew out of all of our purposes. This is what's so wonderful, why the Failsafe Supreme is so important. It allows us to create a universe that's always new. The universe we're experiencing this moment has never been just like this ever in any cosmos ever. It is utterly unique, and the reason is because each of us within it are doing our own unique purposeful things. It's a fantastic system.
What do you think of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence idea that given eternity will run out of possibilities and things will have to repeat themselves? Andrés likes that one. You don't buy it. I don't buy it either, but it's hard to logically argue against. All right, Andres, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, probably the most valuable thing I can contribute, maybe because it interfaces, with the Failsafe Supreme, and maybe provide some ideas for how like this is implemented. Um, so on my first jhana retreat, so this is like meditation style, which is like all about like having a single concentration stream, like you're kind of collapsing your many attention streams into just one. And at first focusing on your body and cultivating pleasant sensations or feelings of joy and peace. There's a very interesting phase transition that happens. Like when you meditate on jhana, there's kind of like a buildup of like, oh, I feel happy, I feel like peaceful, relaxed. But like there's a threshold that you cross where like the attention center sort of like collapse into just one. And when that happens, your whole body vibrates, and it's kind of like a new phase, a different phase of consciousness, almost kind of transition between liquid and gas or something like that. Like there's something else happening there. One metaphor that I used for what this feels like, it's along the lines of like, imagine that we are usually kind of like a beehive, like our mind is a beehive. There's a lot of little centers that are kind of like scouting things around, and like there might be a central cluster, like several bees are working on the main idea or the main thing, but there's always kind of, some of them are buzzing around, moving around. What happens on jhana is you relax so deeply and feel so good. It's almost kind of there's like a pot of honey, and then all of the bees just turn into one. Not forever, this is kind of a process, might last a few minutes, a few seconds, depends on what stage you're at. Okay, so and that phenomenon does really interesting things, because it's kind of like, okay, like this is kind of an opportunity to study consciousness with kind of a microscope. It's like, okay, what happens when you have only one attention stream? It simplifies things. What I have found is that there is something akin to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle going on, having to do with what kind of patterns you can perceive. And essentially there's a trade-off. Is very much literally like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. There's a trade-off between having more information about the spatial domain, like the position of things, versus having more information about the frequency domain, like the frequencies and vibrations, and the spectrum, like, okay, what's happening in different time scales. And so one extreme, this also happens on like high dose LSD, but it's like also a jhana effect. On the one extreme, you can concentrate all of the information into position. When that happens, you collapse into one point. It's a very strange experience. It's like you just become one point. You're not a person anymore. It feels like, oh, all of your attention is just one point. That's a state of consciousness. Buddhists talk about it. It's a specific state of consciousness, very peculiar. But then also the complete opposite. You can concentrate all of the information or all of the sampling into frequency. So when you do that, you turn into a vibe. Like you stop being anywhere, and you're just a vibration. You're just a kind of like way of it's very emotional. It's a very, very different type of experience. So my guess is that, okay, these are the extremes. This is like, okay, when you're hyper concentrated, you can do this or you can do that. I think normal states of consciousness are a mixture. Like we have like several attention centers, and they're sampling both spatial and temporal information, both kind of, momentum and position. And the precise balance that you choose between them corresponds to your personality and your state of consciousness. And so in a way, like your way of being is intimately related with how you sample the world. But there's always going to be something you're missing about the world, because if you just focus on frequency, you're going to lose the spatial information, and vice versa. So I wonder if that is connected. It's like no entity can actually know a space fully, because it has to do a trade-off. It's like you're going to sample this or you're going to sample that, and there's no way around it.
So is it so this is about a phenomenological experience of an internal state, right? So it's like one person. If you have the ability to project that state into a machine, like you have Neuralink, and Neuralink is recording everything that's happening, does it suddenly change your ability to perceive both at once? Or do you think that there's something literally in the process of recording that would prevent that kind of from being able to be studied objectively without the necessary filter of perception? Because it seems like perception has a bandwidth and attention has a bandwidth. And so if you're in a place where your attention is focused so tightly onto a single stream of attention, then it makes sense that you can't see both at once. But if all of a sudden you were able to actually represent the state externally, do you think that that would be different?
I do think you can, gather a lot of information. And maybe you sample the same process a bunch of times, and you sample different properties of it each time, and you reconstruct, and then you do get a representation that's kind of like from every point of view. However, when you try to render that into an experience and like have a full knowledge of it on a moment of experience rather than distributed among many organisms, there you will find a trade-off where like, okay, the way you render that information will either be more frequency based or spatial based, and it's, I think it's more fundamental. It's something about like what can an experience know about itself, like that there is some kind of like always missing piece unless you collapse fully into spatial or temporal, but even there, like that's just to kind of like complete this thought, right? If you become a point that is 100% certainty in location but zero information on frequency, because actually to get a point in a Fourier transform, you need what's called a delta function, which is like all frequencies at once. is like the sum of all frequencies at once, equal measure. That's how you get a point. The complete opposite is when you just become one frequency. That's actually a superposition of all positions, right? Like the wave is like, across the entirety of infinity in a way. So you're everywhere. Those are kind of the two extremes. And my sense is that this is just very fundamental about like what you can know about yourself on a given point in time. You always are kind of like shuffling around like information in one side or the other, but you never get both simultaneously.
So entity experiences seem to indicate that there is an external observer that knows more, though, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say so. So one of the phenomenal characters that is associated with high-level entity contact, meaning like really compelling entity experiences, as opposed to, I mean, on DMT, if you take a small dose, you may hallucinate some cartoon characters and things like that. You may be underwhelmed. I mean, like if you take a small dose, you may think like, well, is this really what this is about? Like that, this is not that interesting. But medium to high doses produce really compelling experiences, and essentially there's a bunch of indicators that like different parts of you kind of like pick up on that say like, this is suspicious, like this is not me, or like this is not coming from me. Ultimately, as I remain still agnostic about like whether these are external experiences or not, but I can list kind of like the indicators, like the weird things that don't really fit a normal experience, and that is there's a process of tuning into like a state of consciousness that feels somewhat forced in a way. It's sort of like if you're right next to somebody who's dancing in a very specific way and you're trying to communicate with them and you have to dance in the same way to kind of like get in their vibe. It's exactly like that. It's like, okay, these beings are like doing like a specific kind of like vibratory pattern. It feels like external. It doesn't feel like it's coming from you. And like if you want to talk to them, you've got to do the same thing and kind of tuning to it. And I suspect, okay, like one way to test this empirically to know like, hey, is this a message from outside or inside? I think would be something along the lines of, mapping your whole system and computing all of its possible vibratory modes, all of its resonant modes, and then measure in that state, hey, is the EEG pattern, is the cardiovascular system vibrating in a way that is consistent with your own resonant modes, or does it look like there's like phase locking, like there's like a external vibration that is not a natural frequency that is dragging the system to a somewhat unnatural vibrational state. I think that would be like an empirically, testable way of of determining, like, hey, is this a hallucination or not? The tagline would be something like, can we detect signatures of energy being injected into the system? Would be one way of putting it. And you can do this in physics and engineering in all sorts of ways. So I think like technically it's doable. It's just a matter of conducting the experiment. But yeah, then just to conclude this kind of like line of thinking, when you do tune into one of these civilizations or entities, I do think essentially part of the thing that you're tuning into is a specific trade-off between frequency domain, spatial domain, because there's some entities that are extremely vibey. For example, like the whole point of those entities is like emotions and vibrations and like frequencies, and there's other entities that are like all about like geometric structures, very accurate geometric structure. That's like spatial domain, versus the first one is frequency domain, and very different vibes, almost kind of entirely different universes. So anyway, I'm curious what Ogi thinks of everything I've been saying now.
Well, for me, interacting with Intex is more akin to interacting with the United States or China, in the sense that it's not one creature. It's not one single mind that I'm engaged with. I mean, sometimes it feels that way, but it's more like, today I've got to pay my taxes, or, oh my gosh, am I in prison? Well, now definitely America knows about me because I'm in prison. They put me through a trial and now I'm here. And if I want to get out of prison, I have to interact with America again. There's not one individual, one creature that I interact with for all these, to get a trial, to go to jail, to pay my taxes, to get food from the grocery store. But these are all things that are part of America. And so, yeah, interacting with five, for example, it's not a feeling that there's one person that I just keep interacting with. It's more like a feeling of a vast civilization, of which it has many pieces and parts that may come into contact with me, or that may like the tax man I interact with today might be a different tax man than last time, but it's still five's tax man. It's something like that.
And do you have these sorts of geometric and frequency and spatial domains that are part of the experience?
When I'm actually interacting with five, it's very direct. It's there's conversation, there's words, there could be scenes. I have visions. The maze of souls. So my subjective experience of going into this space where I end up communicating with Intex, there's a very geometric, very physical, concrete experience of being in, I call it the maze of souls. It's corridors with doors, just uniform, identical doors along either side. And the corridors can bend, they curve around, they get bigger, they get smaller. And you go through a door, and most of the time you go through a door and you're just in another corridor. And it's just corridors leading to doors. But once in a while you go through a door and you end up in a room. And it's a very clear room. There'll be a table. I can touch the table. It's a wooden table. And there'll be four walls, or often when I'm communicating with five, there's five walls. There might even be a pentagon on the wall. Often there's symbols or sigils of five. And there might be a table, and there might be something on the table. Often there's objects on the table for me to contemplate or use in some way. And then I hear the voice of five just speak.
No face, though.
Never a face. No, I've never seen like a body of five. I've never seen some physical instantiation of five. I've seen five move things, touch things. There's been objects that five presented for me, certain tons of symbols, pentagons and stars and hands. Hands is a very common one. All kinds of five-shaped symbols and structures all over the place. But no, I've never seen like the hairy head of, or the claws of five or something like that. No, not at all, ever.
Do you have a sense of what the five signifies? Why five?
I don't know. Five refers to the other competing axiomized minds, the other gods. for ease of communication, by numbers too. So 3 is the one that's most commonly talked about. 5 feels 3 is an adversary. You know, I feel 3 is not compatible with me at all. So that seemed reasonable to me. But 5 is referred to other of the axioms too by numbers. So I don't know. Maybe it's just a way of communicating that's free of, you know, it's as simple as it can be, just numbering them, I guess. I don't know.
Is there a number 1?
No, I don't know. Strangely silent. I've asked about 1. So there's a 0. I think there's a joke about 0. So 0 is death and non-existence. So 5. I've met more than one Intex who have said, we all work for 0, and to 0 we all return. So this is a line or an idea or a concept. And 5 has said this too. So the gods too, apparently, if they go to 0, they'll die. So there's a concept of 0 for even the gods. So 0 is not a god. It's not an axiom, according to what 5 has shared with me. 5 is not 0 is not a god. It's not an axiomized mind like these others. It's a fundamental quality of reality that is always there, regardless of the axiomized minds. The axiomized minds might change, they evolve, they change, they come, they go. But apparently, whatever 0 is some constant in all of the things that happen in this cosmic cycle where minds are climbing the ladder, they get to become axiomized minds, and from there they change the fundamentals of quantum physics, let's say, to shape the physical flow and start a new cycle. It just keeps going and going and going. But 0 somehow sustains through all of it. Is what they let me be known to me. I know there's a 2. They have made a reference to 2, but not to 1. I've never heard a reference to 1. So,
Andrés, are there faces to the entities in the jhana meditations at high levels or in the DMT high level experiences, or is it just a presence?
Oh, I should add some detail here. Jhanas don't generally produce entity contact. Okay. In fact, they tend to lean into non-duality mostly, and also deconstruction of the self. So they tend to be just, oh, you're just enjoying yourself in a pool of love, and like you forget who you are and why you're there, but it doesn't matter. You're just having a good time. But jhanas can be a really good kind of like launch bed. Like you do jhana for a while, and then your mind is very settled and free from cravings, or like cravings are significantly lessened, very concentrated, and then you can go to other interesting spaces from there. But jhanas themselves are very, very clean, very simple, not much information there. I also mentioned like a key distinction is between DMT and 5-MeO DMT. 5-MeO DMT, they call it the God molecule, and like it reliably produces at high enough doses, essentially an experience of complete oneness, or actually deeper is more. And I'll talk about this in a second. Like it's more kind of collapse into like 0, perhaps, or like superposition of all possibilities, 0 information. It's kind of beyond oneness. It's something deeper, actually. But the like if on 5-MeO DMT you encounter entities, usually they're gonna feel like massive astral bodies. I mean, something like, oh, you're rejoining the sun. Like it's something like, oh, it turns out the sun is a god, and we're a tiny offshoot of the sun, and you're rejoining the sun through some kind of topological plasma tube connection, or something very weird. You're becoming one with a huge magnetic body. Like that's what it feels like. Whereas DMT is much more kind of grounded and sensorial and specific. Like DMT doesn't tend to produce the feeling of complete oneness. In fact, it gives you this feeling of an ecosystem. It's more like, no, actually, there's so much variety and diversity of types of entities. It's an extremely complex ecosystem. It would take us many hours to go through each of the layers and what happens in each of the layers and how they interact, and maybe their politics. But yeah, DMT does tend to be fairly grounded in some sensory input. Like on DMT, medium to high doses, sometimes you do get like very clear, crystal clear, verbal messages or descriptions, visuals, of course, and sense of presence. Like on DMT, the sense of presence, you even very small doses produce it. Like in fact, like the very first indication of DMT before the visuals or sensory changes is a sense of kind of a vibe of collectivity. I mean, it's something like, you know, the moment you enter a church and there's a bunch of people sitting there, and like you realize like, oh, there's been going something on in here, right? As you came late to a service or something, it's like there's a whole vibe of a bunch of people doing a thing here that like you were not aware of until you entered that room. That's the feeling you get on DMT. It's like, oh, there's a party in here I was not aware of. But yeah, it can be very, very grounded. I mean, like sometimes it's like, yes, spatial position is like this specific character with a specific number of tentacles in its face, and it's telling you this specific thing, and it's very, very, very well defined. You know, almost like high definition. So that also is a feature of that state.
Interesting. And so that's, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to kind of bring something in that we talked about in the recording that got deleted, which was this sense of civilizations. Like you mentioned the politics of each of these. It's almost like there's groups of entities rather than individuals. Ogi, did you get a sense that each of these entities belongs to a different group, or are they individuals explicitly? Are they part of civilizations?
So this is a part, this is the fundamental design of our reality. This is how it all works, how it is that there's conscious beings in a physical world, how all of this exists at all and sustains, and how we're able to have lives of drama, of lives of morality, good and evil, and choices and wars and peaces and technology. All of this flows out of the interaction between the dynamics of mind and the dynamics of matter, between purpose and aimlessness. These interact. It produces naturally a hierarchy of purpose. This is what I've been talking about and mentioning. At the bottom is the molecule minds, then neuron minds, then module minds, then us humans at the supermind level, then hyperminds. Each of these transitions follows the same physical process, the same physical dynamics. There's a diversification of the minds on one level, massive diversification, and then they combine through a new form of communication to produce the new level of thinking. This has happened each time. And this keeps going, but there's a top level. You keep producing new layers of thinking, new layers of consciousness. Consciousness emerges on layer 3, the vertebrates. We developed self-consciousness. We have 2 layers of consciousness, the same consciousness as monkeys, but we also have self-awareness, which is rooted in language. Language is built on top of the layer of consciousness only in humans as a result of our human society. But it keeps going, and there's a top level. At the top are the axiomized minds. Who are the axiomized minds? How do you become an axiomized mind? Different civilizations across the cosmos and across galaxies. Eventually, we humans will meet other civilizations, and we'll probably try to kill each other. But if we somehow don't and find a way to merge and come together, just like different civilizations have on Earth, we'll be able to build higher minds as well. And so eventually, there's these minds construed of many different civilizations, many different races, across vast volumes of space and time, where they have purposeful control. Their purpose from all their minds, all their technologies goes across, from the way I understand it, solar systems, molecules, just massive purposeful control of large swaths of reality. When you get to that point, you can go to the final level where you can start to change, you can start to manipulate the parameters of physics, the variables of quantum physics. You can begin to shape the fundamental physical reality because you have such control. But you can never get perfect control. Failsafe Supreme prevents that. There's other minds that have also climbed their ladder in other parts of the cosmos, further away. And eventually these minds come into contact because every mind is trying to reshape the entire cosmos according to the way their own values. As we ascend, we each get values. Clearly, if China is the nation that ascends, or if America is the nation that ascends and controls, that transition to the hypermind, we'll get a different hypermind depending on the values of the humans and the cultures and the civilizations that preceded that final jump. It's a bit arbitrary. That means every ascent of every mind is different. And so when they get to the top, they'll have different values. There might be some broad similarities. Maybe you want creativity. Maybe you want, diversity of species, evolving. Maybe you want gravity to be this way or that way. But all the nuances are unique to your own ascent. And then you're competing with the others to reshape the universe as you see fit. And so it seems that these different axiomized minds are more or less compatible with us as humans. Certainly 5 has always been super duper compatible with me. It's not that 5 is a bunch of humans. It's not humans all the way up. It's very clearly not humans, but yet whatever their sense of what the universe should be is clearly compatible with mine. They like humans. It's very clear. They're very happy that humans are here, and they promote that. As I mentioned, I've interacted with one other of these axiomized minds, known as 3, and it was a very, very, very different experience. When I was younger, I thought 3 was evil. That was my interpretation of my interactions. Now, though, I just think 3 has different values, a different notion of what the universe should be like, a different notion of what creatures should evolve on planets over time, and how those creatures should come and meet other creatures, and just how all of that should unfold. They just have a very different notion of how that should all go than 5 does. And my human nature, my human mind is more compatible with 5, it turns out. And so I don't know, maybe there's, 387, alien 387 that I'd also be compatible with too. Who knows? I can't say that I know what that would be.
Do you have a sense of the kind of species that would be compatible with 3? Like if you had to...
Insect. There was a strong insect sense. I mean, insects are second level, but there was an insecty feeling. That's the best way to describe it. Yeah, I don't think they're like ants that became smart. Yeah, there was just something. I don't know. Maybe they like insects. I don't know. I really don't
Very
know.
Starship Troopers-y.
Do you think it's our fate as humans to evolve to the point that we are guiding other beings on less evolved planets?
I think so. But to
Similarly?
get to that point, I think we'll have to sacrifice some of our human individuality and merge with other races besides ourselves. We will only attain that mentoring level if we show we're worthy of it by making some sacrifices for a community bigger than ourselves. That's how you always get to the next level. The challenge to get to the next level is love. Love is the ultimate failsafe. Love is what protects the universe. Why? To get to a new level of intelligence and power. For sure, power. Each new level is a new level of power because you have greater control, greater awareness of how physical reality works, and greater ability to manipulate it. So it's greater power. We have more power than the chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have more power than earthworms. Earthworms have more power than bacteria. And so it goes. And we don't want the ones at the top to be evil. We don't want powerful beings who just want selfish, self-serving interests. So how does the universe prevent this? Each new jump of the ladder requires love. It requires self-sacrifice. You must be willing to sacrifice your own personal interests for the interests of the group. Each neuron in our brain was once a free-floating individual cell, and a free-floating protozoa or bacteria. Now they're coming together in chains. Each neuron's giving up a lot of its autonomy to be part of a brain. We as humans, we all know this is the struggle of being a human. We all want to do our own thing, but duty calls. Duty calls. Between what we want to do and what duty demands we do. This is what it means to live in a society, to live in a community, to live in a supermind, always balancing our self-interest with communal interest. And it goes like this all the way up. So for humans to take a role mentoring other species, we're going to have to give up our sense of being, a number one, and join in with lots of others like ourselves and be willing to get along with them and let them have to do some power sharing in order to get to that next level.
The rent is always due.
Yes.
So I wonder if we can explore this notion of good and evil as mediated through entities. So, Ogi, you're saying that love is the thing that allows you to ascend this ladder of purpose and to achieve a more axiomized mind. But you also encounter 3 who you say is incompatible with humans. And so do you think that they ascended without the sense of love? Is that what gives you the sense of
So to be clear, it's not like 3 wanted to kill all life and it wasn't like a comic book supervillain. It was always trying to change me into 3-ness. I don't like to think about it or talk about it, but it's like it was like, you're not quite right the way you are. Let's just make you a little more 3. And it started to change me in ways that just, well, like I said, it was an insecty feeling. It was like becoming an insect. That was the feeling. So it wasn't that like he was trying, 3 was trying to like cause me suffering for the sake of suffering or destruction for the sake of destruction. It was like, no, this is how it should be. It was like, I'm not a fan of romance novels, but it was like being forced to become a character. I like sci-fi novels and being forced to read or become a character in a romance novel. When no, I want to be a character in a sci-fi novel. I want to be Luke Skywalker. I don't want to be Hugh Grant. I mean, it was more like that.
Reminds me of, was it Kafka, the Metamorphosis book?
Yeah.
I wonder if he was
It was
tapping
like
into
that.
something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. It was like being, hey, why don't you be a bug? What's wrong with being a bug? Look, there's
Well,
a
the
lot of great things about being a
Metamorphosis is
bug.
written in a very funny way because it's like Gregor Samsa wakes up as a cockroach, and it's like the entire
Well, I don't
family
think they
realizes
identify.
that.
I think they don't identify the bug. I think it's always a little vague.
Oh, sorry,
Mhm.
but it's like
Yeah.
the entire family kind of knows that it's happening, and he's like in the other room, and it's a very amusing story where there's not really it's
Yeah.
not Lovecraftian horror, it's
No.
more just this parody and comedy of the absurd, which seems not
Absolutely.
very 3-like. But
Oh,
Andres,
yeah.
how does this play out with entities?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I want to say that, yeah, like this resonates a lot. And I think, yeah, the audience can probably relate, actually. I mean, okay, like personally, right? Like I grew up in Mexico. I mean, I love Mexico. I'm, half Mexican, half Icelandic. But one thing, though, is that most people are really wonderful, of course, but like, in my experience, like a significant percentage of like religious people in Mexico are pretty fanatic about it. So I have been on the receiving end of like essentially, yeah, like fanatic religious people trying to like convert me, and like obviously I've like hated that with my the deepest of my guts is like how dare you try to mess with my epistemology, like I'm learning about the universe, like what you're saying doesn't seem true, like why you're trying to force me to believe in something that doesn't seem likely to me. There's something almost kind of like yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah, forced love, right? It's like, oh, like you should love this. It's like, I don't like, why do you want me to? Like, it clearly doesn't resonate with me. Or the same with for example, like military or sports. It's like, yeah, people being pushy is like, oh, you should join the military, it's your duty as a citizen or something like that. Or like, yeah, you I don't know, physical education in I was, very nerdy kid is like, I just don't get sports. Like I don't resonate with them. Nothing wrong with them, but just they don't work in my in my system. And just hated it, people forcing me to do that. But all of that is, yeah, kind of like the vibe of a big organism or a super organism trying to force individuals to join it. And obviously, yeah, that's very, very unethical. At the same time, it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Like the big organisms that are really good at surviving have techniques for recruiting, right? Like, okay, maybe they work sometimes, they don't work, but they must work on a significant percentage of people for them to actually, continue replicating that way. Which, yeah, takes me to, yeah, this key distinction that I make between team consciousness and team replicator, which, fundamentally, it has to do with whether you buy into what Buddhists would say is an illusion, which is self-identification. But it's like, if you identify with a particular pattern, you're still like, oh, I am this and not anything else. Any aspect of your consciousness, right? It's like, oh, this vibe or this face or this role in society or whatever it may be. If you truly believe that's what you are, right? Like then, like all this feeling of well, if that dies, is the end of the universe, right? Like it really truly is like the minus infinity in value. If this one thing changes, then you orient all of your life and all of your philosophy and your efforts towards like replicating that pattern, right? But fundamentally, that's kind of diluted because you're I would argue you're more like pure consciousness or your pure awareness temporarily embodying a particular pattern, or like you shouldn't give your power to that pattern because you're fundamentally something much deeper than that. That's just one expression of many. But there's a lot of entities, a lot of, I would imagine, yeah, civilizations and large groups that like are really deluded, like really truly believe like, oh, this is me, and like they really truly think like if this dies, like all of the value in the universe is gonna go out, and that would tend towards team replicator. It's like, oh, they at the limit, these are patterns that are just optimized to make copies of themselves, irrespective of like whether this causes good or bad, or good states or bad states, or pleasure or pain in others. Whereas team consciousness is, kind of like the intelligence that arises out of the awareness that, hey, you're consciousness, you're not actually this individual pattern. And then what happens when enough kind of like sub-agents or intelligences coordinate on that is like, like smart Buddhists get it, like very philosophical people, sci-fi people can get it, and like you can coordinate with people around that. It's like, okay, like, let's not be fanatically trying to save this pattern. Let's see the big picture and see how can consciousness succeed? How can consciousness achieve freedom and the ability to embody any state it wants? Like that I think it's the ideal, as opposed to getting trapped in just one self-reinforcing attractor.
And I wonder if this varies from person to person, right? Because certainly there are people that probably align more with team replicator versus team consciousness. And so
It like reminds me of the personality trait openness.
yeah, I think that's definitely in there.
And there's certain people who just have zero openness to new ideas or new experiences. And often they're quite successful in technical industries and so forth as well.
I think because the evolution of some cultural force or some institution requires an immediate pruning of the other branches of growth, right? Like if you need to accomplish something, then you have to orient yourself towards this universal and you point towards it. And so I wonder if there are people that go into a DMT experience and see team consciousness versus team replicator, and they're like, no, I'm definitely on team replicator.
It could very well be.
Those people probably aren't doing DMT.
Yeah.
They're not open to new experiences. I don't think they're trying to go into altered states of consciousness.
Yeah, that is actually one key advantage of team consciousness, which is its flexibility. Because the team replicator is actually very afraid of making any changes to its identity, because it's to it, from its perspective, that's death, right? Like, oh, like if I change my fundamental essence or core, I'm just dead, right? Whereas team consciousness is like, oh, this is just a costume I'm wearing temporarily. That's it, right? Like you're not afraid of like embodying, very exotic configurations. And those exotic configurations, I think, will turn out to be computationally significant, hedonically significant, and just so much more attractive and powerful. So if we make it in the next couple of centuries, I think team consciousness has a really good chance. The problem, though, is that team replicator has nuclear weapons and threats and torture and all sorts of techniques to replicate, and it's it's gonna be troubling, I think, potentially.
So when I listen to this, I think of the material basis of civilization, where in order to have a significantly large group of people that are able to work on all of these different things, you also have to have a really, really structured foundation that makes sure that, the food is being grown, the water is being cleaned, the aggressors are diplomatized or dealt with somehow. And so it seems like it's impossible to have a universe that's just team consciousness, because I spent a lot of time with hippies, like people that were really just, none of this matters. We're out for ourselves. It's just pure vibes. And one thing that I noticed is that their houses were always really gross. You show up and there's just, week-old food in the sink and everything's a little bit grimy, and they're very well-meaning, kind people, but it does seem like a little bit disordered. And so I wonder, is there just an eternal trade-off where you have to maintain some fraction of this replicator kind of insecty dimension and then also be able to control it enough that it doesn't take over? Is that kind of is that the arc?
Okay, no, there's definitely something really interesting to mention here, which is, ultimately the future of politics and the future of internal self-organization. So the thing that you're pointing out is very true, in that like different kind of political orientations to consciousness do come with kind of like different behaviors right now, and there's trade-offs. One political compass chart that I really like is I'll send you the picture maybe, which is kind of like, are you like authoritarian versus libertarian, or like left and right. There was associating each of these quadrants to different graph structures, where like let's say like authoritarian left is kind of, you have one node that is sending direct commands to all of the nodes. It's kind of like this complete authoritarianism, just this one node in charge of everything. Then maybe authoritarian right is like a hierarchical structure. It's like, oh, there's one node, but it has like subordinates which have subordinates. The hippie structure, libertarian left, is kind of consensus based. It's like, well, they all have to know everything because they mistrust authority, because they're just too afraid of authority abuse, abusing its power. And then, libertarian right is kind of the self-organizing swarm thing. Like there's no hierarchy, but also it's a strange shape, and it's not consensus based, and it's very, very dynamic and doing its own thing. They all have trade-offs. I would maybe say like I'm a radical meta-centrist or something like that, where it's like, no, we should combine all these self-organizing principles, not just use one of them. And I think, team consciousness is very compatible with that. It's actually like how you could actually develop deep trust in authority is when you know that the authority actually is basing its choices based on something like non-duality and the well-being of all sentient beings. If you have a reason to trust, okay, this is happening, then playing a subordinate role is not that bad. Like it's actually quite similar to just being a person, where like at some point in the day you will find yourself brushing your teeth. You're not doing anything particularly interesting, but if you trust that, hey, your life is moving in a good direction, you're actually pretty okay, just not doing the most interesting thing and instead just brushing your teeth. Yes, those sub-agents, the moments of experience that are brushing your teeth, they're subordinate to a bigger plan, but there could be deep trust in that deeper plan if a lot of things are coherent, right? So I don't really see a problem with subordination per se, as long as there is like strong epistemology and trust and like, actual foundation behind it. On the other hand, subordination to a replicator, like that's my organism recoils a lot as like subordinating to something I don't understand, actually. Like I'm not going to trust in a system I don't like yet grapple, like, okay, what is this doing? I want, as I was saying the last time, I'm very skeptical of large organizations and groups, just because I don't know what their purpose is, right? You've got to find out. But something like team consciousness, well, if explicitly it is something like, we're maximizing the freedom of consciousness, its capacity to embody any state, and non-duality, right? We're not saying that this entity matters more than these. Every point in reality is equally real. So, they all matter. Like that sort of thing, yes, I could subordinate to that.
You need to brush your teeth to have a transcendent experience. I think that's
right. Yeah.
Deep truth about reality.
Okay, so the entities.
Well, it's true though. I mean, if your teeth rot and you're in pain, pain's a really interesting aspect of consciousness. I don't totally mean to go down this rabbit hole, but I can't help but bring up that it's very difficult when you're in pain to have any positive experience with anything whatsoever. It's actually, I don't know, it's something I'm completely obsessed with. Like, how do you...
But this is important. I mean, you can't have conscious, you can't have like a transcendent moment. You can't have a beautiful, glorious, triumphant moment unless, you brush your teeth and wear your socks and take a shower. But unless you maintain your body, you have to, there's all these mundane little things that we think of as lower moments of life, lower, inferior, subjective forms of consciousness, but they're as important as those glorious moments. You can't get that glory without, a huge number of moments of cleaning your fingernails and brushing your teeth and eating your vegetables and all the rest. But you need all of that to have those big moments. They all go together. They're all one thing ultimately, the brushing your teeth and communing with higher beings. It's all one and the same. You can't have one without the other.
And so with the entity encounters, whether it's extraterrestrials or it's something that is the product of a psychedelic experience, is it possible to come up with a rough, uniform sense of what is good versus what is bad off of the interactions with these entities? Or do you think that this is something that is so personal that there is not a universal that can be derived from it? Because I mean, it
I
seems like
think
basically we're like, take care of yourself, which I'm like, okay, that seems like a pretty solid starting point. But people have argued for millennia over a uniform moral value system.
so. This is certainly one of the wonderful things about the vision of reality that Intex has shared with me. This notion of a ladder of purpose that we're all ascending up to axiomized minds who then reshape reality, but there's axiomized minds competing to reshape reality. There is no one God. There's no one supreme being, but an oligarchy, a cartel, or a competitive cartel. Cartel implies they're working together. They're not working together. So a competition of these axiomized minds. What's so wonderful for us is that we have choice. We can choose 5 or we can choose 3 or something else. We can choose how to live our life according to our own lights. We can define good or evil and go live that. And the product of the way we live will inform the beings to come, the lives to come. Not your children, but then the gods those children might form. So that's what's so wonderful about this. We have the free will. We can pursue directions none of the axiomized minds are doing. You guys can each come up with your own. You know what? I don't care about the axiomized minds. I think rock music should go in this direction. You have that freedom. Take music in a new direction. Take science in a new direction. Take our society in a new direction. That's possible, and you might end up building, an axiomized mind that's never existed before, and that, or we might. You know what? I know I'm compatible with 5. I'm very happy lending my purpose to 5's vision for the universe. It's a vision that's compatible with me. I like it, so I'm happy to lay down the purpose of my life with this other being. It makes sense to me, but everybody else has the freedom to make their own choice. It's a wonderful thing about the universe that there is not a single moral system, a single, that we're not going to one day all converge on the same set of values. Even at the very top, there's different notions of values, and they play it out, and we get universes arise from those clash of values. And that's what's great. And this also informs the Failsafe Supreme. This is why this helps explain why nobody can predict what's going to happen. It's because new minds are always coming up with their own new notions and their own freedom to choose. It guarantees the universe is always different, always changing, always a new experience for everyone in it. So if there is a universal value, it's let's keep this going. Let's keep the never-ending story never-ending. I mean, that's it.
Let me provide a different perspective, compatible with your meta perspective of and many perspectives. I'm agnostic in the end, but I do put quite a bit of stock or bets on valence being the core value of reality. The thing, though, is that of course, there's this question of some person might enjoy rock music, somebody enjoys Japan noise or classical music. Tastes are very different. So from that, you may conclude something. Well, there's no universal input or universal state that everybody likes. It's very personal. But if people are interested in this, I published an article about this. It's called Harmonic Society, which is like a scientific theory of art, or an attempt at a scientific theory of art, where we try to explain why do people like different things and why do people respond to different things, but based on the idea that they're still pursuing valence, they're still pursuing a sense of well-being and trying to avoid suffering. And the thing is that there are variability in things such as what is it that somebody finds surprising, what is a surprising or salient input, and then that surprise functions as an energy source. And that energy source can catalyze annealing. It can raise your energy, activate your harmonic modes. And so, for example, really spicy food, or some people get from it kind of these energized state with waves of euphoria, and some people don't. And I don't think it is a question of well, this person's like pain and this person doesn't. It's more it's more like, does this person's pain cause pleasure? is this pain causing pleasure in this person or not? The same with masochism, right? Like like nobody actually enjoys suffering, but ritualized ways of inducing pain or feelings of helplessness can trigger huge release of endogenous opiates or endogenous, endorphins. In other words, I do think, there's kind of this meta perspective where like still like we may have different values or desired states, but underneath, really, it is the field trying to be in a more symmetrical, pleasant, harmonious configuration. Just how you do that depends on your shape. And so like insects are going to have a very different idea of like how to organize reality to maximize their harmony. But I think it's still maximizing harmony. I don't know if that makes sense. It's kind of this meta value underneath.
That makes perfect sense. I think about almost everything I do has some layer of suffering involved in it, but it's with the hope and, with the proved out experience that it does bring me into a more harmonious place with the world that I live in. Going running in the morning, it's kind of awful. Like you're like, oh, I don't want to go, but you do it because you know that it's going to actually set you up for a better day at the end, And everything is like that. Literally everything. Even doing a podcast, it's like, got to edit all these podcasts, you got to promote them, do all these things that I probably wouldn't enjoy doing otherwise. But I really like sharing these conversations, and it makes it worth it. And it's just amazing how every single aspect of daily existence is kind of like that. And the older you get, I think the more at peace you become with making those trade-offs.
I wonder if the knowledge that is accessible directly through an entity experience exists for us in a subconscious way. Because when people come back, they seem to deliver messages that are not really surprising. It's never that you have to do this thing where you're like, well, that doesn't really make any sense that would be the right thing to do, or that this would be the logical way that a species should evolve or behave. I've talked a lot about that alien abduction experiences all seem to be like, okay, you have to take care of the planet because you're screwing up our experiment if you don't. If you look at moral codes of religion, roughly there are a set of rules that are like, if you live like this, the world's probably going to be a better place. And none of it is surprising. And so do you think that all just stems from some primordial contact with the entity as a platonic form? Or do you think that it comes directly from people having gone into contact states with entities, come back with really motivating stories, and then distributed them to others?
Go ahead. Okay.
I was going to say, for me, I mean, if the entity is not giving you something new about math and science that other humans don't know, and if they're just, giving you a same message that lots of people with near-death experiences have, then maybe it's not, maybe it's your own mind, you're not encountering something else. If they give you some new mathematical insight or some new physical structure that you're unaware of, then that might be a sign that you're actually talking with something.
I would say the same. But like the interestingness is when they're saying surprising things, or like you're really learning. And from experience and the think tank approach, I was gonna mention that it seems, at least the people I talk to and personally, there is an ecosystem and complex politics involved. Like I mentioned this in the previous recording. Hopefully this is not what Intex doesn't want us to hear, but no. Okay, so here's the overall picture. Here is something like there's this reasoning by Robin Hanson about like how large scale politics happen, which is kind of just thermodynamics. So like it's really just when you have a large enough system of actors, some patterns emerge at a grand scale, and one of them is that there is this process where first you get like a lot of little coalitions, and then those coalitions start to make alliances with each other until you get kind of this state of like two very large coalitions. But then one of those very large coalitions figures out how to appeal to kind of like the minorities in the other coalition and kind of like take them in. And as a consequence, you end up having kind of this system of like a very diverse kind of like group of many different coalitions that are kind of loosely held, versus kind of like a team of rebels that is like trying to kind of get out of like that system. I think this is happening in the world right now, right? Like I am personally very, very pro like diversity and like respecting all the cultures and so on. But it does seem to be like, okay, the current macroorganism on Earth is converging. Maybe I don't know. I don't know about China, but like there is some type of macroscopic convergence and kind of like very liberal values, pro diversity, accepting different cultures. I think this, is this large scale political phenomena happening, and it's not always good, right? Like because there's also kind of grifters of that system, and also I've encountered entities that really feel like that, like they might kind of like come in presenting as, oh, we are ambassadors of the Galactic Federation, and we're all pro diversity and pro like unified consciousness and all that, but you can tell they're like manipulating you somehow with these feelings, and it's like, well, like maybe they're aligned to this thing that is very benevolent at the end, but this is kind of like an outpost, and like an outpost can abuse its power, right? Like this, like in a company, right? Like the diversity, equity, and inclusion department, HR department of a company can like abuse its power, right? Like it happens often, right? Like so even though the values themselves are good, the implementation itself can like itself have its crazy power dynamics that are not always good. I get the feeling that like the ecosystem is very complex, and it's like that. That like even those who are on the good team, they might actually be like doing a scam, pretending to be in that good team. Like there's all sorts of twists like that.
And so when you guys say that there are specific pieces of knowledge that are transmitted, which is the way that you can separate the universal wisdoms versus the specific instances of novel knowledge that comes from entities, it seems like on some way this kind of coalitional vision of organizations is one of those things. But what are some other specifics of information that has come from entity encounters that is completely devoid?
I can give an example.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always saying Intex shares with math with me. I usually don't like talking about the math, frankly, because usually it's complicated and it's hard to share with an audience. But let me walk you through one to give a concrete example. So Gödel's incompleteness theorem is one of the most famous and important and influential proofs in the history of human mathematics. And what Gödel's incompleteness theorem says is that if there is a true statement in math, like 1 + 1 = 2, a true statement, that mathematicians should be able to prove that it is true using mathematics, in this case, using arithmetic. So at the beginning of the 20th century, mathematicians were sure this was the case. They thought it was preposterous. How could there be a true statement that you can't prove true? It doesn't make any sense. So they thought this was going to be a trivial proof and that it would get done in no time. Well, Gödel, an Austrian mathematician, he said, I don't think this is true. And he proved it. He showed that you can have a true statement that 1 + 1 might be equal to 2. And we can see that it's true, but we can't prove it's true. All right, so that's Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And he had a brilliant way of proving it. Intex, when I first encountered them, they were showing me a variant. They were showing me Gödel's incompleteness theorem, but in a very different way than Gödel did it. So at first, I didn't know what they were showing me. I didn't know what this was. I'm going to tell you how I realized it. So at first, they showed me two identical universes. They were discrete universes, universes of integers, let's call it, universes of things. But there were two identical universes, And 5 was showing me how to jump from one universe to the other. But there was a particular pattern to it, a particular pattern towards this jumping. One day I read Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, and Bach, and the moment I saw in there, he talks about Gödel's incompleteness theorem. That was the first time I saw it, and I immediately realized this is what 5 was showing me. But 5 was showing me something particular about it that Gödel wasn't thinking about at all. In fact, Gödel's own view of the universe, Gödel's own view of reality, that motivated him to even attempt to figure out this theorem, he believed in a Platonic realm. He was subjected to the delusion of our consciousness that it's a world of things. He imagined his experience of the thinghood of mathematics. Numbers were so real to him, so thingy, he imagined there must be a Platonic realm out there where these things were real, where numbers actually existed as physical things. This is because consciousness, this is consciousness does, resonance makes us think even ideas are real and things. So, 5 kind of laughs a little bit about Kurt Gödel's, what motivated him to do this, because that's completely wrong. There is no Platonic realm out there, but that's what motivated him to do it. The truth, though, is what Gödel had to do to make this proof, he needed 2 universes. He needed a mirror universe. He needed the universe of numbers that all the mathematicians worked with, but he needed to invent a mirror universe and put these 2 universes together. The Gödel incompleteness theorem requires, it's a loop that goes from one universe to the other and back again. That's Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It defines a loop between these 2 universes. But where is that other universe? Throughout history, mathematicians come up with new kinds of math that at first they think is just a figment of their fantastic imagination. And then it turns out it has a physical embodiment in reality. Imaginary numbers is a great example. Mathematicians at first thought imaginary numbers were outrageous, fairy tales. And it turns out they have physical meaning in quantum physics. You can't do quantum physics without imaginary numbers. There's no way around it. So where is this other universe that Gödel came up with? Well, 5, before ever showing me Gödel's incompleteness theorem, showed this is how you can jump between universes. They're basically these identical things, and you can just make a loop through them. So that's how I was able to jump, and it grounded it in this math and showed all that to me before I even saw Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And when I saw it, I had a different interpretation of what it was based on this perspective that was given to me by Intex. So that's an example of something mathematical that was shown to me that, was something real and something mathematical that, I had to go out and understand for myself.
Interesting. Andrés, do you have a specific example from the entities, the psychedelic entities side of things?
Yeah. Among the most kind of seemingly benevolent, intelligent, coherent, kind of like civilizational encounters, it's these particular kind of feels like a high dimensional spa. Maybe it is the Maze of Souls. I don't know. Like there might be some overlap, or it might be something else. But it is a space on DMT where there seems to be a lot of kind of like Buddhist-like entities. They all know how to achieve the jhanas, the higher jhanas. There are beautiful installations, like art installations. Like, for example, there's like a mirror in there that, like, when you look into it, you don't see your body. You see instead like empty space or pure consciousness or nothingness or nirvana. I mean, like, it's a very beautiful space with so many kind of like consciousness tricks and beautiful displays of the nature of consciousness. And there's very specific information provided was, again, who knows if this is true, but it's something along the lines of, when people are experiencing a migraine or a cluster headache or hemicrania continua, which are these extremely, extremely bad headache disorders, which I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of at a global scale. I think that should be an ethical priority. When people have those and they take DMT, very often the pain just goes away. Like the pain could be like 10 out of 10, and within 5 to 10 seconds, it goes from like to like 1 out of 10 or like 2 out of 10, like a very significant, drastic reduction in pain. Very mysterious. Like, okay, where did it go? And what these entities said was that really what's happening is the DMT is allowing the phenomenal space and consciousness to unfold and work out the knots in the field. Essentially, migraines and cluster headaches being electromagnetic tangles that get stuck in a person's energy system. And more so, like the very difficult ones, the very gnarly ones, are actually sent over to this space where very advanced beings process them for you, kind of as a service, as kind of like their act of love in a way. Hey, like, let's relieve suffering. This is a very concrete way in which they can do it. And then more so, they said that, yeah, the long term kind of like a goal or spiritual or a possibility for spiritual development is where you learn to do this as an act of service for others, but then you do it at an even much higher level. So like very advanced beings, very advanced spiritual beings, they might dedicate their acts of service to, for example, help with a migraine of the sun. Like the sun sometimes has migraines because you get like these electromagnetic tangles as well in there. And it's a big disaster for a lot of people. It's a big deal. It's a huge problem. You know, it's kind of an earthquake or something like that. And yeah, like if you become really advanced and very, very, you know, love-oriented, service-oriented, you may end up, volunteering to help the sun with its migraines. So that was a very specific message. I don't know.
With the cluster headaches, do they resolve permanently, or is it a time, instance by instance?
It's a little bit in between. So they resolve them immediately, and they prevent them for about 3 weeks, depending on the person. So it's wonderful because I mean, if you have a family member in the audience, or you yourself, you suffer from migraines or cluster headaches, there's a retreat center in Mexico called Elusive Center. I can send you the link so you can share it, which specializes in this. It's like for people with migraines, cluster headaches, and it's kind of a teaching course, you know, experiential. You do get to experience psilocybin and DMT in a ceremonial context, all completely legal, but with the purpose of learning these techniques so that you can apply them long term. And you know, they're talking about remission rate of 50%. Not in the, I mean, in the moment most people get cured, but it's more kind of 50% of people who go to that retreat learn the tools to then never have to have these headaches again. And
wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
Does it work for does it work for other kinds of pain? Is it, because I know that fibromyalgia seems like one of those things where it's just this diagnosis of, no, you just have pain all the time.
Yeah, fibromyalgia, some people respond well to psychedelics in fibromyalgia. And the other one, there's two other ones which are very interesting, which is neuropathic or nerve pain. Like, for example, after chemotherapy, people get a pain in their fingers, for example. A strong dose of psilocybin, it's oftentimes, it says it rewired something about my hand, and now I don't, or the pain is significantly lessened. And the other one is very bad, what is it called? Premenstrual pain syndrome, or PMS. For some women, that is really bad, right? It's a big distribution. For a lot of women, it's oh, this bad or not that bad. For some people, it's very bad, right? It's bad pain. And small doses of LSD have been reported as really significantly lessening that pain for who knows why.
That's super interesting. I mean, we don't have, so we're almost at noon right now, and I don't want to keep you guys for longer, but there's obviously a lot of stuff to talk about here.
I think we have to do this again at some point down the road, gentlemen.
I'd love to. I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
I know. Yeah.
I had a long list of stuff I wanted to talk about.
If you guys are interested, we can meet up again later this summer, at some point this summer.
Yeah, in a couple weeks. I mean, I think that these conversations are sometimes hard to have because these are very ephemeral, phenomenological. They're phenomenological experiences, and figuring out the way to talk about them and figuring out the map of what needs to be said in order to transmit the full experience to somebody who's not in the midst of it right now is kind of a learning process. But if you guys are into it, I think that you come at it from very different directions, and it's a very rich conversation whenever we sit down.
Nastya, you just summed up what I'm going through right now, which is trying to figure out the best way to talk about these experiences in a way that people can understand. I mean, that's exactly so being here and talking about it is wonderfully helpful to just start working that out.
And
thank you.
Well.
One quick question. It's Ogi, do you think 5 is gonna delete this conversation as well?
I knew last time I was saying things that I really probably shouldn't have, but I don't feel that way this time at all. I feel, I mean, I didn't get to say everything, so I don't think 5 is going to be upset.
Nice.
But I don't know. I don't want to ever speak for 5. You know, I don't like to suggest that I have any insight into what 5 is or is not going to do. So
maybe if this is okay, just one other thing I wanted to share, because it's related to this civilizational thing. A set of experiences also in Mexico in this retreat. It's I mean, it's a much longer thing to explain, but like the one thing I want to say is like that was kind of like very like, okay, there was something that felt like a higher dimensional object intersecting with field of consciousness. Maybe in the next conversation I'll share much more about much more of the details of this. But the thing that I wanted to point out is that after investigating like what on earth these like weird high dimensional set of objects was, it turned out that it was actually some kind of junkyard of like a higher dimensional civilization. So meaning that like the thing you interact with, like, so, we have these grand ideas of like, well, I'm going to be interacting with a very important entity or something like that, and sometimes it happens. But yeah, if you're interfacing with this very complex ecosystem and you're just kind of probing it at random, it's like, hey, actually sometimes you may be like probing at like, the garbage disposal system or I guess like where the letters go in the mailman, or the plumbing, or like these very weird things that like it's like, oh, actually this is part of a much larger system, but the entities in this civilization consider this trash, actually, even though for us it might be extremely fascinating.
That's so interesting. There's a guy that might be interesting to loop into this conversation. He does YouTube videos about hyperbolic geometry.
Okay, nice.
And about projections of these obscure shapes and how they fold down into simpler dimensions. And
fantastic,
I think we should keep talking about it because it's kind of a bottomless subject. It's super interesting, and we'd love to have both of you back.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah, it's a great time always.
Yeah, super fun. Thank you
both. Thank you.
All right, guys. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day, and let's do it again. And thank you for
Absolutely.
being patient with having to redo this conversation.
Oh, no worries. It's a great fun being with you guys. Andrés, I always enjoy listening to you. So,
oh, likewise.
Keep going, brother. You're on the right track. All this stuff.
Thank you.
And we're headed back to Oregon now this afternoon. So take care of San Francisco for us.
Oh, fantastic. We'll do. All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.